Hello, midnight wanderers, and welcome to Dreadvane. This is where ancient whispers rise beneath a crimson sky, carrying you softly into the world of dreams and shadows. Before tonight's haunting story begins, tell me, what corner of the world are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. And if the silence of the night calls to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, so you'll never miss the moon's next dark secret. I used to live alone on a country road about 20 miles outside the nearest town. The house was an old farmhouse that sat around 100 yards back from the road. It was surrounded by open land, trees, and long stretches of darkness at night. My closest neighbor lived about a mile away in one direction. The next closest person was about a mile in the other direction. There were no streetlights, no nearby businesses, and very little traffic after dark. Once the sun went down, the area became almost completely silent. The house itself was old and full of character. The floors creaked, the walls made small noises when the temperature changed, and the pipes sometimes knocked. Wind could move through gaps around the windows and make quiet whistles. At first, those sounds bothered me, but after living there for more than a year, I had become used to them. I knew which floorboards creaked when I stepped on them. I knew how the house sounded during heavy rain, and how it sounded when the weather turned cold. I could tell the difference between a tree branch scratching the roof and an animal moving outside. Living alone that far from town never frightened me. I was a big guy, and I knew how to handle myself. I had never felt helpless or especially vulnerable. In fact, I enjoyed the privacy. I liked being able to come home and know that nobody was nearby. There were no loud neighbors, no traffic, and no people walking past the house. The isolation felt peaceful. There was one serious problem with the location, though. I was outside cell phone range. My phone did not work at the house, and I did not have a home phone installed. At the time, I did not think much about that. I had a vehicle, and the town was only 20 miles away. If I ever needed something, I could drive to a place where my phone worked, or go to a neighbor's house. That seemed good enough. I never expected to need help immediately. One night I came home at around 11 o'clock. It had been a normal evening. I do not remember anything unusual happening before I reached the house. The road was dark, as always, and there were no other vehicles moving nearby. As I approached my driveway, I noticed a truck parked on the side of the road near my mailbox. It was strange because people rarely stopped there, especially that late. The road did not lead to many places, and anyone driving through usually had a reason. I slowed down and looked at the truck as I passed. I could not see anyone standing beside it. There were no flashing hazard lights, and I did not notice the hood being open. It simply sat there in the darkness near the mailbox. My first thought was that someone had broken down. That happened sometimes on country roads. A person might leave a vehicle overnight and return in the morning with tools, gas, or another truck. I considered stopping, but I was tired and did not see anyone asking for help. It was late, and I assumed whoever owned the truck had already gone somewhere else. I turned into my driveway and continued toward the farmhouse. The driveway was long enough that the truck became harder to see as I moved closer to the house. I parked, got out, and went inside. I did not feel afraid. The truck seemed unusual, but not dangerous. When I entered the farmhouse, everything appeared normal. I did what I would describe as a half-hearted walkthrough. I moved through the main rooms and looked around without checking every corner carefully. Nothing seemed disturbed. There were no broken windows, open doors, or overturned objects. I did not see anyone. The house looked exactly as I had left it. Because I had lived alone for so long, I did not normally search the entire house when I came home. I locked the doors, But I was not the kind of person who checked closets or looked under beds. The area was quiet, and I had never experienced a break-in. That night, I changed out of my clothes and settled in front of the television. I watched TV for about an hour. The sound filled the old house and covered many of its usual creaks. Outside, everything was dark. From the windows, there was almost nothing to see except the faint shapes of trees and the open yard. The truck near the mailbox crossed my mind once or twice, but I did not worry about it. If the driver had needed help, I assumed they would have walked to the house and knocked on the door. Nobody did. Around midnight, I turned off the television and went to bed. The house became quiet again. I lay in the dark for a while, trying to fall asleep. I could hear the ordinary sounds of the farmhouse settling around me. Then I heard a creak. It sounded like one of the floorboards outside the bedroom. I noticed it, but I did not react immediately. Old houses make noises. That was nothing new. I stayed still and listened. Nothing followed. After a short time, I began to relax again. Then I heard another creak. This one sounded slightly different. It was not loud, but it seemed closer. It sounded less like the house settling and more like weight pressing down on a board. I opened my eyes and stared into the darkness. The bedroom door led into a hallway that connected to the front part of the house. From where I lay, I could not see much beyond the doorway. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe the wood had shifted. Maybe the temperature had dropped and caused the floor to move. A couple of minutes passed. The silence became uncomfortable. Then there was another creak. That third sound changed everything. The noises were too far apart to be the normal settling of the house, and they seemed to be moving. It sounded as if someone was trying to walk slowly through the hallway, placing each foot carefully to avoid making noise. I remained completely still. My heart began beating harder. I tried to understand what I was hearing without moving or giving away that I was awake. The house had been locked. I had walked through it when I came home. I had spent an hour watching television. If someone was inside, they had either entered without me noticing or had already been hiding there. The second possibility was far worse. I reached toward the light switch beside the bed. I moved slowly, trying not to make the mattress creak. For a second, my hand hovered near the switch. Then I turned on the light. The bedroom filled with sudden brightness. At that exact moment, someone in the hallway took off running. I did not see the person clearly. I only caught movement beyond the bedroom door and heard the sound of fast footsteps. Whoever it was had been standing or moving just outside my room. The person ran toward the front of the house. Almost immediately, there was a loud crash. They tripped over the coffee table in the living room and went down hard. The table scraped across the floor, and something struck the entertainment center. The impact was so violent that it shook the room. For a moment, there was confused movement. Then the person got up and kept running. I heard the front door being pulled open. Then there was another crash as the intruder went straight through the screen door. The old screen door slammed and rattled behind them. I sat on the bed, completely awake now. Everything had happened in only a few seconds. Someone had been inside my house. They had been near my bedroom while I was lying in bed. The thought was difficult to accept. My first reaction was anger. I wanted to get up and chase the person, but I did not know whether they were armed. I did not know whether they had come alone. I stayed where I was for several seconds. Listening, the house became quiet again. I could hear my own breathing. I looked around the bedroom for something I could use to defend myself. Then I stood and moved toward the hallway, I switched on every light as I went. The hallway was empty. The living room looked as if someone had run through it in a panic. The coffee table had been knocked out of place. Items around the entertainment center had fallen or shifted. The front door was open, and the damaged screen door moved slightly outside. I moved cautiously through the house, checking the corners and listening for any sign that the intruder had returned. Then I heard an engine in the distance. It came from the road near my mailbox. The truck started. For a moment, the engine idled. Then the vehicle pulled away and disappeared down the dark road. That seemed to explain everything. The truck had not broken down. It had been waiting. Whoever had run from my house had reached the road, climbed into the truck, and left. I stepped out onto the front porch. The night was cold and still. The truck's taillights were already gone. I stood there trying to think through what had happened. I needed to call the police, but I had no service at the house and no landline. The nearest neighbor was a mile away. I could get into my vehicle and drive toward town, but that meant leaving the house immediately. I did not know whether the intruder had taken anything or whether there was evidence I should not disturb. I also did not know what the person had wanted. Had they been there to steal? Had they entered while I was watching television? Had they been watching me from another room? The questions came quickly, and I could not organize my thoughts. The front porch light shone across part of the yard, but beyond that circle of light, the property disappeared into darkness. I kept staring toward the road, expecting the truck to return. Then I heard another sound behind me. The back door opened. The noise was unmistakable. It was followed by fast footsteps running through the dry leaves behind the house. I spun around. Someone else was fleeing from the back of the farmhouse. The sound moved rapidly away from the building, toward the darker part of the property. For a moment, I could not move. There had been 2 people inside. While I was focused on the first intruder running through the front door, another person had remained hidden in the house. I had walked through the hallway and living room, while that second person was still somewhere behind me. They may have been in the kitchen, a back room, or a closet. They had waited until I stepped onto the porch, then escaped through the back. That realization frightened me more than the first intruder. The person in the hallway had been close to my bedroom, but at least they had run immediately when I turned on the light. The second person had stayed quiet. They had heard the crashes, the open door, and the truck leaving. They had listened while I moved through the house, turning on lights. They knew I was still inside. I had no idea where they had been hiding or how close I had come to them. I moved back inside and shut the front door. Then I locked it. I crossed the house carefully and looked toward the open back door. The yard beyond it was completely dark. I did not go outside to follow the second person. There were too many places to hide, and I had no idea whether they had a weapon. I locked the back door as well. Then I searched the entire house properly. This time, I checked everything. I opened closets, looked behind doors, checked under beds, and searched every room. I moved slowly and kept listening. The house was empty. At least, it was empty by then. I never found out exactly how the 2 intruders entered. Maybe I had forgotten to lock a door before leaving earlier that day. Maybe they forced a lock without causing obvious damage. It was also possible they had entered through a window. What disturbed me most was the timing. The truck was already parked near my mailbox when I came home. That meant the men may have arrived before me. They might have been inside the house when I pulled into the driveway. If that was true, they had watched me walk in. They had listened while I moved from room to room. They had waited through the entire hour I sat watching television. I tried to remember whether I had heard anything during that time. Maybe one of the ordinary creaks had not been the house. Maybe a small sound from another room had been a person shifting their weight. I thought about the quick walk-through I had done when I entered. I had looked into the main rooms, but had not checked every hiding place. One or both of them could have been only a few feet away. They may have stood behind a door while I passed. They may have crouched in a closet or stayed in one of the back rooms. The idea made my skin crawl. There was also the possibility that they entered after I came home. Maybe one person stayed near the truck while the other moved quietly toward the farmhouse. Maybe they had watched the windows and waited until I went to bed. But the fact that two people fled from different doors made me believe they had probably entered together. I eventually drove far enough to get a phone signal and contacted the authorities. By then, the truck and both intruders were long gone. I gave the best description I could, but I had not seen either man clearly. The darkness, the speed, and the shock made it impossible to provide useful details. I could describe the truck only in a general way. The first person had been little more than a moving shape in the hallway. The second person had never entered the light. Nothing obvious seemed to be missing from the house. That almost made the experience worse. If they had entered only to steal, I could understand their purpose. But if nothing was taken, why were they there? Maybe they had been interrupted before they could steal anything. Maybe they had planned to take larger items after I left again. Maybe they had not expected me to return that night. Or maybe theft was not their only reason for entering. That question stayed in my mind. After the incident, the farmhouse no longer felt peaceful. I changed the locks. I checked the doors and windows several times every night. I tried to make the house more secure, but nothing felt like enough. Before going to bed, I walked through every room. I opened closets, looked behind curtains, and checked under furniture. Then I would lie in bed and listen. Every creak became a footstep. Every small sound made me reach for the light. The house had always been noisy, but now I could not separate its normal sounds from the memory of someone moving through the hallway. I kept thinking about the second intruder. The first one had made noise and panicked. The other had remained hidden and silent. I imagined that person standing in the dark while I searched the front of the house. Sometimes I pictured them watching me through a doorway. Other times I imagined them only a few feet behind me, waiting for a chance to escape. I installed stronger locks and tried different ways to secure the doors, but I could never lock the house tightly enough to feel comfortable. The problem was not only the building, it was the isolation. Before that night, living 20 miles outside town had felt like freedom. Afterward, it felt dangerous. If someone came back, I could not call for help. No neighbor would hear me shout. A vehicle could park by the road without anyone noticing. Someone could enter the property and disappear into the darkness. I had always believed I could protect myself because I was large and physically capable. That night showed me that strength was not enough. It does not matter how big you are if someone is already inside your home while you are asleep. It does not matter if you can fight when you do not know how many people are there or whether they are armed. For weeks, I barely slept. I stayed awake listening to the old farmhouse. During the day, I felt foolish for being so nervous. The intruders had run away, and they never returned. But when darkness came, the fear returned as well. I would look toward the hallway and remember the sound of those careful creaks. I would picture the chair scraping, the crash into the entertainment center, and the screen door breaking open. Then I would remember the back door. That second opening, the footsteps through the leaves, knowing another person had still been inside while I stood on the porch. I lived there for about 5 more weeks. I tried to convince myself that I could get over it. I told myself it had been a random event. I told myself the new locks were secure, and the men would not return. None of it worked. The house had changed in my mind. It no longer felt like my home. It felt like a place where strangers had hidden in the dark and waited for me to fall asleep. Eventually, I decided to leave. 5 weeks after the break-in, I moved back into the city. Some people might think that was an extreme reaction, especially because I had lived in the farmhouse without trouble for more than a year. But peace is difficult to rebuild once it is broken in that way. In the city, I had neighbors close by. My phone worked. There were streetlights, traffic, and people within shouting distance. The noise that once would have bothered me became comforting. I missed the privacy of the country, but I did not miss the silence. I still think about that night sometimes. I wonder who those men were and what they planned to do. I wonder how long they had been inside the house. I wonder where the second person was hiding when I walked through the rooms. Most of all, I wonder what would have happened if I had not heard that third creak. Maybe they would have left quietly. Maybe they would have taken my belongings. Or maybe one of them would have reached the bedroom before I woke. I will never know. All I know is that I lived alone in an isolated farmhouse, and one night, 2 strangers were inside it with me. One was standing in the hallway outside my bedroom. The other stayed hidden even after the first one ran. That was enough to make me leave the country and never look at an old house in the same way again. I used to live in an apartment in a decent part of a mid-sized city. The neighborhood was not perfect, but it was the kind of place where most people felt comfortable walking around during the day. There were apartment buildings, small businesses, restaurants, and a few bars nearby. I never considered it especially dangerous. Across the river, however, was a very different neighborhood. That area had a bad reputation throughout the city. Violent crime was common there. People talked about muggings, drug deals, break-ins, assaults, and stolen property. Police cars were a regular sight, and most people who did not live there avoided walking through it after dark. The river created a clear boundary between the 2 areas, but it was not a real barrier. A person could cross a bridge and move from one neighborhood to the other in only a few minutes. Because of that, crime sometimes crossed over as well. I understood this, but I did not spend every day thinking about it. My apartment felt safe enough. I had lived there long enough to become comfortable with the area, and I often walked to nearby businesses without any concern. There was a bar about 1 block from my apartment. It was close enough that driving there would have been pointless. I could walk out of my building, go down the street, and reach it within a few minutes. One weekday night, I decided to walk to the bar to use its ATM. I no longer remember why I needed cash. It may have been for something the next day, or some small expense that required money. The reason seemed important enough at the time for me to leave the apartment, but not important enough for me to remember years later. It was around 11 or 11:30 at night. The sun had been down for hours, and most of the street was dark. A few lights came from apartment windows, storefronts, and street lamps, but there were plenty of shadowed areas between them. It was late enough that the streets were quiet, especially for a weekday. There were not many cars passing, and I did not see many people outside. I walked toward the bar without feeling nervous. The distance was so short that I did not treat it like a serious trip. I was not going through an unfamiliar part of the city or crossing the river into the rough neighborhood. I was simply walking 1 block from my apartment to a place I knew. That sense of familiarity made me careless. I was not paying close attention to everything around me. I was probably thinking about whatever I needed the money for. Or maybe I was not thinking about anything at all. When the bar came into view, I noticed a man near the entrance. He stood close to the glass front door, looking inside. Then he moved to one side and looked through a window. He paced back across the entrance and looked inside again. His movements seemed restless and agitated. He was not standing casually like someone waiting for a friend. He kept shifting his position and checking the inside of the bar from different angles. I saw all of this, but I did not immediately understand that something might be wrong. Sometimes a person looks through a bar window because they are trying to see whether someone they know is inside. Maybe they do not want to pay a cover charge. Maybe they are checking whether the place is crowded. There were many harmless explanations. I continued walking toward him, looking back. That was the first major mistake. My mind had noticed his strange behavior, but I had not consciously processed it. I did not stop and ask myself why he was pacing. I did not look at his hands or consider whether I should cross the street. I simply kept approaching. There was no one else outside the bar. That should have made me more careful. If the entrance area had been crowded, there would have been witnesses and other people nearby. Instead, it was only the two of us on a dark street late at night. The man seemed focused on the people inside the bar. He continued looking through the glass and moving from side to side. I got closer. When I was about 4 paces away from him, I finally noticed what he was holding. There was a large butcher knife in one of his hands. The blade was long and wide, the kind of knife normally used to cut meat in a kitchen. He held it in an unusual position, with the blunt back edge of the blade pressed against the inside of his forearm. The sharp edge faced outward. The way he held it made the knife less visible from inside the bar. Anyone looking through the glass might see his arm without immediately noticing the blade lying along it. It may also have allowed him to move quickly without the knife hanging obviously at his side. The moment I saw it, everything about the situation changed. His pacing no longer looked like impatience. It looked like preparation. His attempts to look through the windows no longer seemed curious. It looked as though he was watching someone or waiting for the right moment. I stopped walking. I had already come far too close. The man immediately sensed the movement behind him. He turned around and looked directly at me. For a brief moment, we stood facing one another. I was only a few steps away from him. There was nothing between us. No car, fence, table, or locked door. He had a large butcher knife in his hand, and I had nothing. I felt startled, but my mind had not fully caught up with the danger. Instead of stepping back, running, or preparing to defend myself, I reacted the way people often react during an ordinary social encounter. We made eye contact, and I automatically said, "Hey, how's it going?" The words came out before I had time to think. It was the same greeting I might have given a neighbor in the hallway, or a stranger passing me on the sidewalk. Under the circumstances, it sounded almost ridiculous. The man paused. He looked at me for a moment. I have often wondered what he was thinking during that silence. Maybe he was surprised that I had spoken to him so casually. Maybe he was trying to decide whether I had noticed the knife. Maybe he was considering whether I was a threat, a witness, or an easy target. The pause felt brief at the time, but in my memory it seems much longer. He could have moved toward me. At that distance, I would have had very little time to react. He could have raised the knife and attacked before I even understood what he was doing. Instead, he answered, "Good." His voice was quick and controlled. Then, he turned and walked away. He did not run. He moved quickly, but not so quickly that he would attract attention. Within moments, he was heading away from the bar and disappearing down the street. I stood there watching him go. I did not follow him. I did not call after him or try to take a photograph. At that time, people did not always have phones ready in their hands the way they do now, and getting closer to him would have been a terrible idea anyway. I walked into the bar. The moment I stepped through the door, I felt some relief. There were lights, noise, and other people around me. The glass and walls created a barrier between me and the man outside. I told someone what I had seen and called the police. I explained that there had been a man outside the entrance holding a large butcher knife. I described his behavior and told them which direction he had gone. The police arrived quickly. They took the situation seriously. Several officers searched the area, and there was a noticeable police presence around the bar and nearby streets for a while. They checked possible escape routes and looked around the surrounding blocks, but they did not find him. I never learned who he was. I never heard that he had been arrested. There were no later news reports that clearly connected him to another crime. The event simply ended with him walking away into the night. At the time, I felt shaken, but I do not think I completely understood how dangerous the situation had been. I had seen the knife and knew something was wrong, but the full meaning did not reach me until the next day. When I told friends, coworkers, and other people about what had happened, their reactions made me look at it differently. They stared at me in disbelief. Some asked why I had continued walking toward him. Others asked why I had greeted him. A few pointed out that he could have attacked me before I even knew the knife was there. The more I described it, the more serious it sounded. A man in an agitated state had been watching people inside a bar late at night while holding a hidden butcher knife. There were many possible reasons he could have been there, and none of them were good. He may have been waiting for a particular person. Maybe someone inside the bar had threatened, cheated, or angered him. Perhaps he intended to attack that person when they came outside. He could have been watching for an employee who had thrown him out earlier. He may have been waiting for an ex-partner, a rival, or someone who owed him money. Another possibility was robbery. Maybe he planned to wait until a customer left the bar alone, then threaten them with the knife and take their money, wallet, or phone. Since the bar had an ATM, he may have known people were leaving with cash. He could have been watching for someone who looked drunk or distracted. There was also the possibility that he had no specific target at all. He may have been angry, high, mentally unstable, or looking for any excuse to use the knife. The way he paced suggested he was struggling with some kind of decision. Perhaps he had arrived intending to hurt someone, but had not yet found the courage to enter. Maybe he was waiting for the right person to come outside. Then, I appeared. I often think about the moment when he turned and looked at me. Before that, he had been focused on the bar. Once he saw me, I became part of the situation. I was close, alone, and unarmed. I had also seen his face and his knife. For a person planning a crime, that could have made me dangerous as a witness. Maybe he considered attacking me simply because I had seen too much. I will never know. The calm greeting may have helped me. By saying, "Hey, how's it going?" I may have confused him. Instead of reacting with panic, fear, or aggression, I treated him like an ordinary person. That could have interrupted whatever thoughts were going through his mind. Perhaps it reminded him that I was a real person, and not only a possible target. Maybe he thought I had not noticed the knife. Maybe he decided that attacking me would create too much attention before he carried out his original plan. It is also possible that my greeting had nothing to do with his decision. He may never have intended to hurt me. All I know is that he paused, said good, and walked away. I was lucky. An attack with a butcher knife would have been horrifying. Unlike what people often see in films, knife attacks are not clean or quick. A person can be badly injured in seconds. Even a single wound can cause permanent damage or death. At such close range, I would have had little chance to escape. The man could have reached me before I turned around. There was no guarantee anyone inside the bar would have noticed immediately. They may have heard something outside only after the attack had already happened. That thought stayed with me. The street had seemed familiar and safe because it was close to my apartment, but safety is not determined by distance from home. Danger can exist 1 block away. It can stand outside a place you have visited many times. It can look like an agitated stranger until you notice what he is holding. The experience also taught me how slowly the mind can recognize danger. I saw the man pacing. I saw him looking through the windows. I saw that no one else was outside. All of those details entered my mind, but I did not put them together until I noticed the knife. By then, I was only 4 steps away. Situational awareness is not simply looking around. It means understanding what you are seeing before you move closer. If I had stopped at a greater distance and watched him for a few seconds, I probably would have noticed the knife earlier. I could have crossed the street, gone back to my apartment, or called the police from a safe location. Instead, I walked directly into the danger because I assumed everything was normal. People often believe they will recognize a threat immediately. They imagine that fear will warn them, or that a dangerous person will behave in an obvious way. That is not always what happens. Sometimes the signs are there, but the brain ignores them because they do not fit what we expect. I expected to walk 1 block, use an ATM, and return home. I did not expect a man with a butcher knife to be waiting outside. Because the situation did not match my expectations, I continued forward without thinking. I have wondered whether the police presence prevented something worse that night. The man may have moved to another location after leaving the bar. He could have thrown away the knife, crossed the river, or hidden in a nearby building. Maybe the arrival of several police cars frightened him enough to abandon whatever he had planned. There is no way to know. I never heard of an attack connected to him, and I hope that means no one was hurt. Still, it bothers me that he was never found. Somewhere in the city, a man walked away with a large knife after being discovered outside a bar. He may have gone home and never done anything. He may have committed another crime that no one connected to my report. He may have been arrested later for something completely different. That uncertainty is part of what makes the memory stay with me. There was no clear ending, no explanation, no moment when the police said, "We found him, and this is what he was planning." There was only the encounter and the question of what might have happened. For a long time afterward, I paid more attention when walking at night. I looked at people's hands. I noticed whether someone was following me or changing direction when I did. I became more careful around entrances, alleys, parked cars, and dark corners. I learned not to assume that a familiar area was automatically safe. This does not mean living in constant fear. It means allowing yourself to notice when something feels wrong. If a person is pacing and looking through windows late at night, there is no reason to continue walking directly toward them. If someone is hiding one hand or acting nervous, it is better to create distance. Crossing the street or turning around may feel rude or embarrassing, but embarrassment is better than injury. I had ignored several warning signs because I did not want to overreact. In the end, I got lucky. The man could have made a different choice. He could have taken 1 step toward me instead of walking away. He could have raised the knife. He could have followed me into the bar or waited outside until I left. Instead, after that brief moment of thought, he decided to leave. I am grateful for that decision, even though I do not know why he made it. Sometimes a person's life can depend on a choice made inside a stranger's mind. That night, I had no control over what he was thinking. I had already placed myself within reach. The only thing standing between me and a possible attack was his decision not to do it. That is not a situation anyone should depend on. Whenever I tell this story, I return to the same lesson. Pay attention to your surroundings. Do not wait until you are 4 steps away to understand what you are seeing. Trust the small details that make a situation feel wrong. A person pacing outside a closed or crowded place may only be waiting for someone, but there is no harm in keeping your distance. I was careless because I felt safe. I lived nearby. The bar was familiar. The walk took only a few minutes. None of that protected me. I still remember the way the knife rested against his forearm. I remember the moment he turned. I remember saying, "Hey, how's it going?" as though we were 2 ordinary strangers passing on the street. I remember his pause. Then, his answer. "Good," and I remember watching him walk away. I will never know what he had planned before I arrived. I will never know whether he thought about using the knife on me. I only know that he could have. That brief encounter taught me something I have never forgotten. Situational awareness can save your life. That night, I did not have enough of it. I survived because I was lucky. Even typing this story now gives me chills. It happened when I was young, probably when I was in 5th grade. I do not remember the exact year, but I remember the house, the room, the darkness, and the sound clearly enough that the memory still makes me uncomfortable. At that age, I watched scary movies sometimes, but I did not truly believe in ghosts. I enjoyed being frightened by stories, but I always thought there was a normal explanation for everything. Strange noises came from pipes or animals. Shadows were caused by headlights or trees moving outside. People saw things when they were tired or half asleep. That was how I thought before this happened, and in many ways, it is still how I think now. My family lived in an ordinary house. It was not an old, falling-down mansion, and it did not look like a place where anything supernatural would happen. There were no strange symbols on the walls, no locked basement rooms, and no stories about people dying inside it. There was one detail that became more interesting later. Our house had been built on land where a church had once stood. I did not think much about that when I was a child. To me, it was simply our home. Later, after I told people what had happened, they treated the former church grounds as proof that the area might be haunted. I never agreed completely, but I understood why it made the story sound stranger. The night of the incident began normally. My grandmother was visiting us and staying overnight. Since she needed somewhere to sleep, she was given my bedroom. That meant I had to sleep on the couch in the living room. I did not mind too much. Sleeping on the couch felt a little like camping inside the house. I could watch television later than usual, and the living room seemed more open and interesting than my bedroom. We also had an extra dog in the house that night. Along with our own dog, we were looking after our dog's sister. The 2 dogs knew each other, but they had different personalities. Our dog was usually calmer. Her sister was more likely to bark at small noises. She might react to someone walking outside, an animal in the yard, or a sound from another part of the house. Once she started, our dog often joined her. That fact became part of the explanation I later gave myself. Eventually, everyone went to bed. My grandmother went into my room. My mother went to her bedroom. The house became quiet, and I settled down on the couch. I do not remember whether I left the television on for a while or turned it off immediately. I probably watched something before falling asleep, but that part of the night is gone from my memory. What I remember is waking up suddenly in the middle of the night. The living room was dark. At first, I did not know why I had woken. I was lying on the couch, surrounded by the strange silence that houses have in the early hours of the morning. Everything familiar looks different at night. Furniture becomes dark shapes. Doorways seem deeper than they are. A coat hanging over a chair can look like a person sitting in the corner. I stayed still for a moment, listening. I had the feeling that I had heard something. I may also have seen movement, but I am less certain about that part. It was like noticing something at the edge of my vision just before waking fully. Maybe there had been a shadow. Maybe I had dreamed that someone moved. Whatever it was, it made me sit up. The living room connected to the rest of the house through an open area or hallway. From the couch, I could see part of the route leading toward the bedrooms. There was one particular area that seemed darker than everything around it. I stared in that direction. Nothing moved. I told myself I was being stupid. I had probably woken from a dream, and my mind was still trying to make sense of the darkness. Then, the dogs reacted. Both of them looked toward the same area I had been watching. One began to bark. The other quickly joined in. Their reaction changed the situation completely. Before that, I could tell myself I had imagined everything. But the dogs were awake now, facing the darkness and barking as if they saw or heard something. I looked from them to the hallway. "What is it?" I whispered. The dogs kept barking. Their bodies seemed tense. Their attention remained fixed on the same place. I do not remember whether their fur stood up or whether they growled. I do not want to add details that I cannot honestly remember. What I clearly remember is that they were barking toward the area I had already found unsettling. That frightened me. Dogs hear things humans cannot. Everyone knows that. They can notice an animal outside, a person walking far away, or a small sound inside the walls. Part of me hoped they had heard a mouse. Another part of me wondered whether someone was inside the house. That possibility was even scarier than a ghost. I slowly got off the couch. I did not want to investigate, but I also did not want to remain there without knowing what had made the dogs react. I stood near the couch and stared into the darkness. The house seemed completely still except for the barking. I listened for footsteps. Nothing. I listened for the sound of a door opening. Nothing. I tried to see whether anyone was standing near the hallway, but I could not make out a person. I may have taken a few steps closer. That was when I heard the voice. It was quiet. Very quiet. It sounded small, almost as if a child or a woman were speaking from somewhere in the darkness. The voice said, "He." The word was stretched out slowly. It was not a normal, cheerful greeting. It was soft and long, as though someone were trying to get my attention without raising their voice. The sound made my entire body freeze. For a second, I could not move. The dogs continued barking toward the same place. I remember the fear hitting me all at once. It was not the enjoyable fear of watching a scary movie. It was the kind of fear that makes your stomach drop and your skin turn cold. Someone or something had just said hello from the dark part of the house. I could not see anyone. My grandmother was supposed to be in my bedroom. My mother was asleep in her room. No one else should have been awake. I did not answer the voice. I did not ask who was there. I turned and ran toward my mother's bedroom. The problem was that the path to her room took me closer to the area where the voice seemed to have come from. I had no choice. To reach her, I had to run toward the thing that had frightened me. That part of the memory still bothers me. I remember moving as quickly as I could, expecting someone to step out in front of me. I thought I might see a face in the darkness. I imagined a hand reaching from the hallway. I expected the voice to speak again, this time closer to my ear. But nothing appeared. I ran through the area and saw no person, shadow, or figure. There was no one standing behind the furniture. No one stepped out of a doorway. I reached my mother's room and woke her. I was frightened and probably not explaining the situation very clearly. I told her I had heard something. I said the dogs had been barking, and then someone had said hello. My mother was tired and had just been woken in the middle of the night. She did not react as if there were an emergency. She may have checked part of the house or listened for a moment, but nobody found anything. The dogs eventually calmed down. The house returned to silence. I do not remember whether I slept in my mother's room for the rest of the night or whether I was sent back to the couch. I hope I was allowed to stay somewhere else, because I cannot imagine willingly lying down in the living room again. The next day, I tried to tell my family exactly what had happened. They did not take it seriously. They told me I had probably been dreaming. They said I watched too many scary movies and was letting my imagination frighten me. To them, it was easy to explain. I was a child. I had woken in the middle of the night. I had been sleeping in an unusual place. The dogs sometimes barked for no reason. A sound from the television, outside or another room, may have seemed like a voice. I understood their reasoning, but I also felt frustrated. I knew I had heard something. The word had been clear. Hey-ee. I had not heard a random creak and decided it was a voice. It had sounded like someone speaking directly into the darkness. The way the dogs reacted made it harder to dismiss. If I had been the only one awake, perhaps I would have accepted that it was a dream. But both dogs had faced the same area and barked. At the time, that felt like proof that something had been there. As I grew older, I spoke about the experience less often. When adults do not believe a child, the child eventually learns to keep certain memories private. I did not want people laughing at me or telling me I was making things up. I also began searching for ordinary explanations. Maybe the dogs heard an animal outside. A cat might have been near a window. There could have been a raccoon, bird, or other animal close to the house. Our dog's sister was known for barking easily. She may have reacted first, and our dog simply copied her. Dogs often follow one another's behavior. One becomes alarmed, and the other joins in without understanding why. That explanation made sense. The voice was harder to explain, but there were still possibilities. Maybe someone outside had spoken. Sound can travel strangely at night, especially when everything is quiet. A person walking down the street might have called to someone, and the word could have carried toward the house. Maybe the television had been left on at a very low volume. A voice from a commercial or program could have played while I was half asleep. Maybe my grandmother had spoken from my room. Perhaps she woke briefly, made a sound, and then went back to sleep without remembering it. It is also possible that I experienced something called a hypnopompic hallucination. That happens when a person is waking from sleep and part of a dream continues into the real world. People can hear voices, see figures, or feel that someone is nearby. The experience can seem completely real. At that age, I had never heard of sleep hallucinations. Now, it seems like one of the most likely explanations. The problem is that knowing an explanation exists does not always make the memory less frightening. I still remember how the voice sounded. It was not inside my head. It seemed to come from the dark area the dogs were facing. It was quiet enough that I had to listen, but clear enough that I understood the word. The voice did not sound angry. It did not threaten me. In some ways, that made it worse. A scream or growl would have been obviously frightening. A soft hello felt personal. It sounded as if something knew I was awake and wanted me to know it was there. Years later, when I was in high school, two of my best friends told me about experiences they believed were paranormal. Their stories were similar in the sense that they involved strange voices, figures, or things happening inside homes. When they told me, I did not take them very seriously. That may sound unfair because I had my own strange experience, but I still did not believe strongly in ghosts. Also, to be honest, Both of those friends were wild and unpredictable people. They often exaggerated stories, made bad decisions, and believed strange things. Because of that, I did not treat their experiences as reliable evidence. They, however, took my childhood stories seriously. When they learned that my house had been built on former church grounds, they became even more convinced. To them, the connection was obvious. A church had once stood there. The church was gone. A house had been built over the land. Then a child heard a voice in the night while dogs barked at an empty space. They believed something connected to the old church remained on the property. I did not agree completely. Church grounds are not automatically haunted. Many churches are peaceful places. Even if people had been buried nearby, that did not mean ghosts were walking through our house. Still, the detail added something uncomfortable to the story. I began wondering what had been on the exact spot where our living room stood. Was it part of the church building? Was it the entrance? A prayer room? A yard? Had there been a cemetery nearby? I never researched it deeply enough to find an answer. Perhaps that was intentional. Part of me did not want to discover anything that would make the memory harder to dismiss. Over time, I pushed the incident into the category of strange childhood experiences. Most paranormal encounters happen at night or around sleep. That is important because the brain behaves differently when a person is exhausted, dreaming, waking, or falling asleep. Darkness also makes ordinary things difficult to identify. Children have active imaginations. Dogs bark at noises humans cannot hear. All of those facts point toward a normal explanation. I accept that. I do not tell people I definitely heard a ghost. I cannot prove that anything paranormal happened. There are no photographs, recordings, or witnesses who heard the voice with me. The dogs cannot tell anyone what they noticed. My family heard nothing and found nothing. The most reasonable answer is that I woke from a dream, heard an ordinary sound, and became frightened because the dogs started barking. But even after giving myself that explanation, the memory still sketches me out. There is something about hearing a voice when you believe you are alone that stays with you. The sound does not need to be loud. It does not need to say your name or make a threat. A simple hello is enough. Sometimes I imagine the event from another point of view. I picture myself as a child sleeping on the couch in the dark living room. The rest of the family is asleep. Two dogs suddenly raise their heads and stare toward the hallway. They begin barking. The child gets up to investigate. Then, from the darkness, a small voice quietly says hello. When I think of it that way, it sounds like the beginning of a horror film. But nothing else happened. No figure appeared. No door opened by itself. Nothing followed me to my mother's room. The voice never returned. That was my only experience of anything like it. If the house truly was haunted, it never showed itself to me again. That is another reason I doubt the paranormal explanation. Most people who claim to live in haunted homes describe repeated events. They hear footsteps, see shadows, or notice objects moving over months or years. I had one strange night, one voice, one reaction from the dogs, then nothing. Still, a single experience can be enough to change the way a person feels in darkness. For a while, I was afraid to sleep alone in the living room. I may have avoided looking toward that part of the house at night. Even after I became older, there were moments when I woke suddenly and listened for the same sound. I never heard it again. Sometimes I try to recreate the voice in my mind. Was it really long and quiet? Did it sound human? Could it have been a dog whining in a way that resembled speech? Animals can make sounds that seem almost like words. A whining dog distant animal, or air moving through a gap might create something the brain interprets as a voice. Maybe that was all it was. Yet I remember the dogs barking before the hello. It felt like they were reacting to the same presence I sensed. They were not looking at me. They were not barking toward a window on the opposite side of the room. They were focused on the area I was investigating. I know memory changes with time. Every time we remember an event, we may alter small details without noticing. Perhaps the sequence was different. Maybe I heard the voice first, became afraid, and then noticed the dogs barking. Maybe the dogs had been barking for several seconds, and their sounds blended into something that resembled a word. I cannot guarantee that my memory is perfect. What I can say is that the fear was real. I ran toward my mother's room because I believed something was in the house. Even though I had to move closer to the dark area, I did not see anything. That fact should comfort me, but it does not completely. It makes me wonder where the voice came from. There was no visible person. There was no intruder. No family member admitted speaking. The dogs did not chase anything. The sound appeared, frightened me, and then vanished. As an adult, I remain doubtful about ghosts. I do not automatically believe every paranormal story I hear. Many experiences can be explained by sleep, stress, faulty memory, animals, or ordinary sounds. I think people often decide something is supernatural because they do not immediately understand it. Not knowing the explanation does not prove that a ghost was involved. That is what I tell myself about my own experience. I was young. I was asleep only moments earlier. I was in a different sleeping place because my grandmother had my room. There was an extra dog in the house that barked frequently. The conditions were perfect for fear and confusion. But none of those explanations completely removes the feeling I get when I remember that voice. I can still picture the dark hallway. I can still remember the dogs facing it. I can still hear that quiet, stretched out greeting. He-ee-ee. It sounded as if someone were waiting for me to notice them. Maybe it was only a dream. Maybe it was an ordinary noise misunderstood by a frightened child. Maybe the dogs were reacting to an animal outside. Or maybe, for one brief moment, something stood in the darkness of a house built on old church grounds and decided to say hello. I will probably never know. What I do know is that the experience has stayed with me from 5th grade into adulthood. Most childhood fears fade. This one did not. Even now, when I wake in a dark room and hear a small noise somewhere in the house, part of me waits for the voice to return. At the time, I was living in a house with 4 roommates. There were 5 of us in total. And because the place was not very large, I shared a bedroom with one of them. We had been living together long enough to know one another's normal habits. We knew who stayed up late, who made noise in the kitchen at night, who took long showers, and who always woke up early. The roommate who shared my room was one of those people who usually woke before me. Almost every morning, I would open my eyes and find his side of the room empty. Sometimes I could hear him moving around somewhere else in the house. Other times, he had already left for work, school, or whatever he needed to do that day. Because of that, the morning this happened felt unusual from the moment I woke up. I opened my eyes and saw that he was still lying in his bed. At first, I did not think anything was wrong. Maybe he was tired. Maybe he had stayed up later than usual. Everyone sleeps longer sometimes. Still, it felt strange because he was normally the first one awake. The room was quiet. Morning light was coming in, but it was still dim enough that the corners looked dark. I stayed in bed for a moment, waking up slowly and looking around. My roommate seemed to be asleep. Then, without warning, he suddenly woke up. He did not wake calmly or stretch like a normal person. He shot awake in panic and yelled at me. "Why didn't you help me?" His voice was loud and full of fear. I stared at him because I had no idea what he was talking about. "What?" I asked. He looked angry, confused, and terrified at the same time. His breathing was heavy, and he seemed as if he had just escaped from something. "Why didn't you help me?" he repeated. I sat up and asked him what had happened. He told me there had been a dead man on top of him. In Mexico, there is a common belief connected to sleep paralysis. People sometimes say that when you wake up unable to move, it feels as if a dead person is lying on top of you. Depending on the region or family, people describe it in different ways. Some believe it is a spirit, a dead man, a witch, a demon, or some other dark presence pressing down on the sleeper. I had heard stories like that before, but I had never taken them seriously. Sleep paralysis has a normal explanation. The mind wakes up before the body fully leaves the sleeping state. For a short time, the person cannot move or speak. Some people also see figures, hear voices, or feel pressure on their chest. Even knowing that, the experience can feel completely real. But at that moment, I did not believe my roommate had experienced anything supernatural. I thought he had suffered a nightmare or sleep paralysis and become confused. Maybe he had dreamed someone was holding him down. Maybe he had seen a shadow in the room and imagined it was a dead man. I told him he was being ridiculous. I said he was probably joking or trying to scare me. He insisted that he was serious. According to him, he had opened his eyes and seen a dead man over him. The figure had been pressing him down, and he could not move. He said he had tried to call for help, but no sound came out. He knew I was in the room with him. He could see me sleeping nearby, and he had tried to get my attention. That was why he had shouted at me after waking. From his point of view, he had been trapped under something terrifying, while I lay only a few feet away and did nothing. I kept telling him it had been a dream. I said there was no dead man in the room. I had not heard anything, and I had not seen anyone enter or leave. The bedroom door had not opened. There was no intruder hiding nearby. Nothing in the room appeared disturbed. My roommate continued arguing with me. He said he knew what he had felt. He was not laughing, and he did not seem proud of the story. He looked deeply shaken. Even then, I was not convinced. People can feel strange things during sleep. Dreams can seem real, especially when someone wakes in the middle of them. I told him that his mind had created the experience and that he needed to calm down. Then, he lifted his sleeves. That was when I stopped talking. There were marks on his arms. They looked like someone had grabbed him. The marks were not small scratches or light red patches from sleeping in an uncomfortable position. They looked like the impressions of fingers pressing into his skin. I moved closer to look at them. They were on both arms, in places that would make sense if someone had been holding him down. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I tried to find an explanation. Maybe he had grabbed his own arms during the nightmare. Maybe his arms had been caught against the bed frame. Maybe one of our other roommates had entered the room and played a cruel joke. But those explanations did not feel convincing. If he had grabbed himself, the positions were strange. If he had struck the bed, the marks should have looked more like bruises or lines, and if someone had entered the room, I should have heard them. I was still lying nearby. The room was not large. A person could not easily stand over my roommate, grab his arms, and leave without making any sound. I asked if the marks had been there the night before. He said no. I asked whether he remembered anyone touching him. He said he remembered the dead man holding him down. That answer made me uncomfortable, but I did not want to show it. I continued trying to be logical. I told him that there had to be another explanation. Maybe he had injured himself without remembering it. Maybe the marks only looked like handprints, because we were already thinking about the story. The human mind is good at finding patterns. If someone says a bruise looks like fingers, everyone starts seeing fingers. That was what I told myself. Still, I could not forget the way he had woken. His fear had looked real. He had not had time to create the marks after waking because I had watched him sit up. He had shouted almost immediately. For the rest of the day, the incident stayed in my mind. I kept thinking about the room and wondering whether anything strange had happened while I slept. Had my roommate really been struggling? Had he tried to call my name? Could someone have stood over him without waking me? I did not believe in ghosts or dead people attacking sleepers, but the marks made the story difficult to dismiss completely. The other roommates eventually heard about what had happened. Some of them laughed. Others took it more seriously. People began sharing stories they had heard from relatives. One said a family member had experienced the same thing. Another said that praying was the only way to make the presence leave. I rolled my eyes at most of it. I still believed it had been sleep paralysis. The marks were strange, but strange did not automatically mean supernatural. After a day or two, the house returned to normal. My roommate's marks began to fade. We stopped discussing the incident as much. It became another strange story that had happened in the house. Then, only a few days later, it happened to me. I went to bed as usual. I do not remember feeling especially frightened before sleeping. I was not expecting anything to happen. I had not been lying awake thinking about my roommate's experience. At some point during the night, I opened my eyes. The room was dark. I could see part of the ceiling and the faint shapes of objects around me. For a second, everything seemed normal. Then I tried to move. Nothing happened. I tried lifting my arm, but it would not respond. I tried turning my head, but I could not. I attempted to move my legs, fingers, or even my shoulders. My entire body felt locked in place. I was awake, but my body remained asleep. Fear hit me immediately. I understood what was happening. It was sleep paralysis. I had heard about it and had just watched my roommate go through something similar. Knowing the name did not make it less frightening. The feeling of being trapped inside your own body is almost impossible to describe. You can see the room. You can think clearly enough to know you are awake, but no matter how hard you command your body to move, it refuses. I tried to speak. My mouth would not open properly. I tried shouting for my roommate. No sound came out. Maybe a weak breath escaped, but it was not enough for anyone to hear. I began to panic. My heart felt as though it were racing, although the rest of my body remained frozen. I thought about the story my roommate had told me. He had said a dead man was lying over him. I did not clearly see a dead man standing in the room, but the memory of his experience filled my mind. I felt as if something was there. I cannot say whether that feeling came from the paralysis or from fear. It may have been my imagination creating a presence, because I expected one. But the room no longer felt empty. There seemed to be a pressure around me. It felt as though something heavy was holding me against the mattress. I wanted to look around, but I could move only my eyes. Even that felt difficult. The dark corners of the room seemed deeper than before. Every shape looked possible. A shadow near the wall could have been a person. A piece of furniture could have been someone watching me. I tried again to move. Nothing. I tried to make a sound. Still nothing. Time changed while I was trapped. The experience may have lasted only a minute or two, but it felt much longer. Every second seemed stretched. I kept thinking that I would remain like that forever. I wondered whether I was dying. I knew people survived sleep paralysis, but panic does not care about facts. When the body will not move and the lungs feel heavy, it is easy to believe something terrible is happening. I thought about waking my roommate. He had blamed me for not helping him, and now he was nearby while I was unable to call out. I wanted to scream his name. My body would not allow it. Then I remembered what the others had said about prayer. I had not taken their stories seriously. I had thought prayer helped only because it calmed frightened people. At that moment, I had no other idea. Since I could not speak, I began praying silently in my mind. I do not remember the exact words. It may not have been a complete prayer. I simply turned my thoughts toward God and asked for help. The moment I began to pray, the paralysis released me. It happened suddenly. 1 second, I was frozen. The next, I could move. I took a deep breath and lifted my body from the bed. My arms and legs responded again. The pressure disappeared. The strange feeling in the room was gone. I sat there, breathing hard, staring around the bedroom. My roommate was still asleep. There was no dead man standing near the bed. There was no figure in the corner. The door was closed, and everything looked normal. But I was terrified. I stayed awake for a long time afterward. I did not want to close my eyes because I feared the paralysis would return. I kept moving my fingers and feet to prove that I was in control of my body. I listened to every sound in the room. Part of me wanted to wake my roommate and tell him what had happened. Another part felt embarrassed because I had laughed at him only a few days earlier. Now I understood why he had been so frightened. The next morning I told him. His reaction was not surprised. It was almost as if he had expected it. I explained that I had opened my eyes and could not move or speak. I told him that the experience ended the exact moment I began to pray. He reminded me that I had said his story was not real. I admitted that I had been wrong about how frightening it could feel. That did not mean I suddenly believed a dead man had attacked us, but I could no longer dismiss the experience as something harmless. Sleep paralysis may have a scientific explanation, but the fear it creates is real. When you are trapped in it, it does not feel like a normal problem in the brain. It feels as if something else is in control. The part that stayed with me most was the timing of the prayer. Maybe it was a coincidence. Sleep paralysis ends on its own. Perhaps my body was already waking fully, and I happened to begin praying at the same moment. Prayer may also have calmed my mind. Once I stopped struggling and focused on something familiar, my fear decreased enough for my body to break out of the paralysis. That is a reasonable explanation. Still, the release felt immediate. It was not gradual. I began to pray, and suddenly I was free. That experience changed the way I thought about what had happened to my roommate. I still cannot explain the marks on his arms. Maybe there was a normal cause we did not discover. He could have grabbed himself during sleep. A person can move during a nightmare before becoming paralyzed. He may have caused the bruises without knowing it. Maybe the marks came from something earlier and only became visible that morning. But after experiencing the paralysis myself, I understood why he believed a dead man had been holding him. The sensation of pressure and the feeling of another presence were powerful. The mind can turn those sensations into a figure. For someone raised with stories about the dead sitting on sleepers, the brain may create exactly that image. Different cultures describe sleep paralysis in different ways. Some people see witches, some see demons. Some describe shadow people standing beside the bed. Others feel an old woman sitting on their chest. In Mexico, many people describe it as a dead person lying over them. The experience may be the same, but the mind gives it a form based on what a person has heard and believed. That explanation makes sense to me. But it does not explain everything emotionally. When I remember the room, I do not only remember being unable to move, I remember the certainty that something was there. Even without seeing a clear figure, I felt watched and held down. Maybe fear created that feeling. Maybe it was only the brain trying to explain why the body was frozen. Or maybe there are some things that happen during sleep that we do not fully understand. My experience lasted only a minute or two. That does not sound long when written down. A person can wait longer than that at a traffic light or while heating food. But when you are awake and trapped inside your body, 1 minute becomes enormous. Every second gives your mind time to imagine something worse. You wonder whether you will breathe normally. You wonder whether the dark shape in the room is moving. You wonder whether the person beside you will wake before whatever is holding you decides to do something else. It was one of the longest moments of my life. The strange thing is that it never happened to me before that night. It has never happened again since. That single experience came only a few days after my roommate woke screaming about a dead man and showed me the marks on his arms. That timing is what makes the story difficult for me to forget. If I had experienced sleep paralysis at some random point years later, I probably would not connect the two events. But it happened in the same room, only days apart. First, my roommate felt something holding him down. Then, I did. I sometimes wonder whether the power of suggestion caused my experience. After hearing his story, perhaps the idea stayed in my unconscious mind. Even though I said I did not believe him, I had seen the marks. Maybe that fear followed me into sleep and triggered the paralysis. That is possible. Stress, exhaustion, unusual sleep schedules, and sleeping on your back can all increase the chance of sleep paralysis. Living with several roommates can also disturb sleep. People stay up late, make noise, and wake at different times. There may have been nothing supernatural in the room. Still, I cannot completely forget how quickly the paralysis ended when I prayed. I cannot forget my roommate's face when he woke. And I cannot forget the finger-shaped marks on his arms. We never found a dead man in the house. Nothing else strange happened that I clearly remember. There were no moving objects, voices in empty rooms, or figures appearing in doorways. Life continued normally. Over time, the incident became a story we told rather than something we discussed every day. But whenever I hear someone talk about sleep paralysis, I remember that room. I remember opening my eyes and realizing that my body did not belong to me for those few moments. I remember trying to scream and producing nothing. I remember turning to prayer because it was the only thing I could still control. Whether it was science, coincidence, faith, or something else, the paralysis released me. I am grateful it never happened again. Once was enough. My roommate had asked why I did not help him. After it happened to me, I finally understood the answer. I had not helped because I did not know he was trapped. He had been lying only a few feet away, fighting something I could not see or hear. Then, a few nights later, I was the one lying there silently, unable to call for help. From the outside, both of us probably looked as if we were sleeping peacefully. Inside, those minutes felt endless. Maybe there was never a dead man in our room. Maybe the marks and the feeling of a presence had ordinary explanations. But when I think about the two experiences happening so close together, I still feel uneasy. There are some nights the body sleeps while the mind wakes. And in that space between dreaming and waking, it can feel as though something else is waiting with you. One of the most frightening experiences of my life happened when I returned to my ground floor apartment late at night after a party and slowly realized that someone had broken into my home. At the time, I thought it was the most terrified I had ever been. Looking back, it may have been the second most frightening experience of my life. But the other story would take even more energy to explain. The strange thing is that once I started remembering this night, I ended up describing far more of it than I originally planned. I lived alone in a very small apartment on the ground floor of a building. The place was not large enough for anyone to get truly lost inside it. There was a small living area, a kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom, a few closets, and a tiny covered porch at the back. The apartment was in an area that did not have a serious reputation for burglary. Crime could happen anywhere, of course, but I did not normally worry about someone breaking in. I locked my doors and windows, but I was not constantly checking them or thinking about security. The back entrance had a narrow window next to it. When I say narrow, I mean it was only about 1 foot wide. I would never have looked at that window and considered it a possible entrance for a person. The back door itself had a double-sided deadbolt. It needed a key from inside as well as outside. This meant someone could not simply reach through a broken window and turn the lock by hand. The keys for that deadbolt were usually kept inside the apartment. I did not think this was dangerous. The window was so narrow that I could not imagine anyone climbing through it. Also, the lock was old and difficult to use. It had a particular trick to it, which I had learned after opening and closing it many times. You had to place the key into the lock, begin turning it, then pull it out slightly at exactly the right moment. If you did not know the trick, the lock would stick and refuse to open. I had become so used to doing it that I no longer thought about it. My hands performed the motion automatically. That old, faulty lock may have saved me from losing far more than I did. On the night this happened, I had gone to a party. I had been drinking, although I do not remember exactly how much. It was probably around 1 a.m, possibly later, when I returned to my apartment. The party had ended for me, but I was not ready to sleep. I was tired physically, yet my mind was still awake. I had that restless feeling people sometimes have after coming home from a noisy place. The music and conversations were gone, but my body had not yet adjusted to the quiet. I entered through the front door. Nothing immediately seemed wrong. There were no broken windows at the front. The door was still locked when I arrived, and the apartment looked normal in the darkness. I turned on some lights and moved around the place without concern. Because the apartment was so small, I assumed I would have noticed if someone were inside. There were not many places for a person to hide. Still, I did not check the closets, look behind doors, or search the rooms carefully. Why would I? I believed I was alone. I had a small bag of old psilocybin mushrooms in the freezer. I had kept them for some possible future occasion with friends. I had tried hallucinogens a few times before, but never by myself. Taking them alone in the middle of the night was not something I had planned. For some reason, however, I opened the freezer, found the bag, and decided to chew a few stems. I still do not know what came over me. Maybe I was bored. Maybe the alcohol lowered my judgment. Maybe I wanted to keep the party feeling going after coming home. Whatever the reason, I ate a small amount. Almost immediately afterward, while I was standing in the kitchen, I noticed something unusual. The key to the back door's deadbolt was sitting on the counter beside the sink. I stopped and looked at it. That was not where I normally kept it. I had a particular place for those keys, and the counter was not it. I stared at them for a few seconds, trying to remember whether I had moved them earlier. Maybe I had used the back door and forgotten to return the key. Maybe I had placed it near the sink without thinking. Because I had been drinking, I did not trust my memory completely. Still, something about it bothered me. The apartment felt different after I noticed the key. Nothing had visibly changed, but the familiar rooms no longer seemed completely safe. I picked up the key and looked toward the back of the apartment. That was when I noticed the narrow window. It was open. I was sure I had not left it that way. The window was next to the back door, leading toward the small porch. The opening was so narrow that I had never considered it a security risk. But now it stood open in the middle of the night. I walked closer. The screen door around the small porch had been damaged. Someone had punched or cut a hole through it to reach the window area. The realization did not hit me all at once. At first, my mind searched for normal explanations. Maybe the window had not been properly closed. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. Maybe someone had damaged the screen earlier, and I had not noticed. But the key on the counter, the open window, and the broken screen did not fit together in any harmless way. Someone had entered the apartment. I began looking around more carefully. Small items were missing. I had a collection of rolled coins that I had been meaning to take to the bank. Those were gone. A pair of binoculars was missing too. There may have been other small things taken, but those were the items I noticed. Then I realized my school backpack was gone. The thief had apparently used my own backpack to carry the stolen items away. That detail made me especially angry. It was bad enough that someone had entered my home and taken my property. They had also packed everything into the bag I used for school and stolen that as well. The evidence was clear now. Someone had broken through the porch screen, squeezed through the 1-foot wide window, searched my apartment, collected small valuables, and tried to leave. The keys on the counter explained part of what happened. The thief had probably wanted to leave through the back door. Climbing through the narrow window once would have been difficult. Climbing out again while carrying a full backpack would have been even harder. The back door was directly beside the window. All the thief needed to do was unlock it from the inside. Luckily for them, I had kept the key close enough to find. Unluckily for them, the lock did not work normally. The thief had taken the key from its usual place, brought it to the door, and tried to turn it. The lock had stuck. They had probably tried several times, becoming increasingly frustrated. Eventually, they gave up and left the key on the counter beside the sink. Then they had to climb out through the narrow window again, taking my backpack and the small stolen items with them. That was my first explanation. It was frightening enough. Then another possibility entered my mind. What if the thief had still been inside when I came home? The front door was the easiest entrance for me, but the thief may not have wanted to use it while escaping. The front of the building was more visible. There was a greater chance of meeting another tenant, a neighbor, or someone walking past. The thief may have planned to leave through the back door so nobody would see them. But because the lock was difficult, they could not open it. If I came home while they were still searching the apartment, they would have been trapped. They could not leave through the front without passing close to me. They may have hidden when they heard my key in the door. I began looking at the apartment differently. Every dark corner became a possible hiding place. The closets, which had seemed too small to matter, suddenly seemed large enough. The area behind the shower curtain, the space beside furniture, and the bedroom all needed to be checked. I could not remember exactly what I had done after entering. Had I walked directly to the kitchen? Had I gone into the bedroom to change clothes? Had I passed a closet without looking inside? I imagined someone standing silently only a few feet away, waiting for me to turn my back. Maybe the thief had climbed out through the window before I arrived. That was the most likely explanation. But I could not prove it. For all I knew, they could still have been inside at that exact moment. The apartment was small, but that did not comfort me anymore. A small space meant there were fewer hiding places, but it also meant that if someone attacked, there would be less room to escape. I was alone. It was after 1 in the morning. I had been drinking. I had also just eaten several mushroom stems. The last part made the situation much worse. I knew the mushrooms would begin affecting me soon. I did not know how strong they still were because they had been sitting in the freezer for a long time. Maybe they had lost most of their power. Maybe they had not. I started imagining the police arriving while I was clearly under the influence. I could not simply ignore the burglary, but I was worried that calling the police would create another problem. How could I explain that I had been drinking at a party and then decided to eat hallucinogenic mushrooms alone immediately before discovering the break-in? Would they think I had imagined everything? Would they believe the missing items and open window were only part of a drug experience? Would I get into trouble? Those questions went through my mind, but the more urgent problem was whether someone remained in the apartment. I listened. The place was silent. No footsteps. No breathing. No movement from the closets. I did not want to search alone, especially while waiting for the mushrooms to take effect. Eventually, I called the police. I tried to sound calm and explain what had happened. I told them that I had returned home and found signs that someone had broken in. I do not remember exactly how much I told them about the drinking or the mushrooms. I may have kept that part to myself, unless they asked. The important thing was that I needed someone to check the apartment. The police arrived and walked through the place with me. It was almost embarrassing how quickly they could search it because the apartment was so small. Still, they checked the rooms, closets, and back area carefully. They made sure nobody remained inside. Whoever had broken in was already gone. That was a huge relief, but it did not remove the fear. The officers looked at the damaged screen, the open window, and the back door. They saw where the intruder had entered and confirmed that it was a real burglary. The fact that the window was only about 1 foot wide surprised everyone. The person who entered must have been thin, small, flexible, or extremely determined. I tried to imagine someone squeezing through that narrow space in the darkness. First, they would have climbed onto the tiny porch. Then they punched or cut through the screen. After opening the window, they pushed their body through sideways, probably scraping themselves against the frame. Once inside, they searched through my belongings. They found the rolled coins. They took the binoculars. They found my school backpack and used it as a container. Then they located the back door key and tried to escape through the door. The lock refused to open because they did not know the trick. I wonder how long they stood there fighting with it. Did they hear sounds outside while trying? Did they think I might return? Did they become desperate? Maybe the key was on the kitchen counter because they had dropped it when they heard me opening the front door. That possibility still bothers me. If the thief had already left, they might have calmly placed the key down after failing to unlock the door. But if I interrupted them, they may have thrown it onto the counter, grabbed the backpack, and rushed toward the window. The timing could have been very close. Perhaps I came through the front door as they were climbing through the back window. Maybe the sound of the television or movement from another room had been them escaping. I had been awake and restless when I came home, but I had not been alert. I had just left a party. I was thinking about nothing important. If I had heard a small sound from the back of the apartment, I might have dismissed it. The thief could have been only seconds away from me. Another disturbing thought was what might have happened if they had successfully opened the back door. The window limited what they could steal. They could only take small items that fit through the narrow opening. The television was too large. Other valuable items may also have been impossible to carry out that way. If they had managed to unlock the door, they could have removed much more. My television probably would have disappeared. They might have taken furniture, electronics, or anything else they could carry. The sticky lock, which had annoyed me many times, prevented that. Before the burglary, I considered the faulty lock an inconvenience. Afterward, I thought of it as protection. The thief had the correct key in their hand and still could not escape through the door. That small mechanical problem changed the entire crime. It forced them to abandon larger items and squeeze back through the same narrow window. The police took the report, but there was probably not much chance of finding the person. I had not seen anyone. There were no cameras, and the stolen items were small and common. The rolled coins could be spent anywhere. The binoculars could be sold. The backpack looked like thousands of other school bags. The thief disappeared with my belongings, and I never learned who they were. After the officers left, I remained in the apartment. By then, the mushrooms had begun to affect me, although I do not remember experiencing a strong trip. Fear, alcohol, adrenaline, and exhaustion may have overwhelmed everything else. The apartment no longer felt like my space. Someone had been inside without permission. They had touched my belongings, opened drawers or cabinets, and decided what was worth taking. They knew the layout of my home. They had stood in the same kitchen where I was standing. That kind of violation is difficult to explain unless it has happened to you. Burglary is not only about losing property. The stolen items can be replaced. The feeling of safety is harder to recover. Before that night, I could enter the apartment, lock the front door, and believe the outside world had been shut out. Afterward, I understood that a narrow window, which I had never considered dangerous, had been large enough for a stranger. For several nights, I checked the doors and windows repeatedly. I looked inside closets when I came home. I listened before entering each room. Every small sound reminded me of the possibility that someone might be hiding nearby. The thought that the thief could have still been inside when I returned never completely left me. I sometimes replayed the moment I noticed the key beside the sink. At first, it had been only a small detail. The key was in the wrong place. That single detail led me to the open window, the damaged screen, and the missing belongings. I wondered what would have happened if I had not noticed it. Maybe I would have gone to bed without realizing someone had entered. Maybe I would have found the missing items the next morning. Or maybe I would have fallen asleep while the thief was still hiding somewhere inside. That is the possibility that truly frightened me. If the intruder had been trapped by the deadbolt when I arrived, they would have had limited choices. They could remain hidden and wait for me to sleep. They could try to climb back through the window without making noise. Or they could confront me. I have no idea whether they carried a weapon. A person willing to break into an occupied building at night may be willing to hurt someone if discovered. I was lucky that there was no confrontation. The thief did not attack me. The police found no one inside. I lost some rolled coins, binoculars, and a backpack, but I was not physically harmed. Still, the experience remained one of the most frightening of my life. The combination of details made it almost unreal. I came home from a party after drinking. I randomly decided to eat old mushrooms from the freezer. Seconds later, I noticed that my back door key had moved. Then, I found an open 1-foot-wide window and realized a stranger had entered my home. While waiting for a hallucinogen to affect me, I had to call the police and ask them to search my apartment for a possible intruder. It sounds like the plot of a strange film, but it happened. The situation could easily have ended much worse. The thief could have been inside when I came through the front door. They could have attacked me or forced their way past me. If they had opened the back door, they could have stolen far more. If the mushrooms had taken effect more strongly before I understood what happened, I might have doubted my own senses and failed to call for help. Instead, I noticed the evidence early enough. I contacted the police. They checked the entire apartment and confirmed I was alone. The event eventually became a story I could tell with some humor, especially the part about having to speak with police after eating mushrooms. But the humor came later. That night, there was nothing funny about standing in a tiny apartment. staring at an open window and wondering whether a stranger was breathing silently behind one of the doors. The thief was gone. At least, that was what the police confirmed. But for a long time afterward, whenever I came home late at night, I checked every room before allowing myself to relax. I never again looked at that narrow window and thought nobody could fit through it. Someone had. They entered my home, searched through my life, filled my school backpack with stolen items, and escaped through an opening barely wide enough for a body. The only thing that stopped them from taking more was a sticky lock they could not understand, and the only thing that protected me from a possible confrontation may have been a few minutes of timing. I honestly do not know for certain whether what I am about to describe is a genuine, accurate memory, or whether some of the details have been distorted over time by whatever lingering trauma I carry from that particular night. But when I was 10 years old, I was woken up one night by a strange, unusual noise. Odd noises like that were fairly common in the place I lived at the time, so my initial reaction was simply to pull my covers up and huddle deep beneath them, trying to settle back into sleep without giving the sound too much additional thought. A short while later, I heard the noise again, and this time I was able to identify it more specifically. It sounded like breathing, and disturbingly, it was perfectly synchronized with my own breathing pattern, matching my rhythm so precisely that it remained essentially hidden within the sound of my own breath. I only became aware of it at all whenever my own breathing pattern happened to shift slightly, briefly exposing this other sound that had been matching me the entire time. Wanting to test whether I was simply being paranoid or imagining things, I made the deliberate decision to suddenly stop breathing altogether for a moment. Sure enough, the moment I did this, the second breathing sound stopped as well, matching my sudden stillness exactly. But then, roughly 1 second later, as though whoever or whatever was responsible for that sound realized it had been caught, the breathing started up again entirely on its own, no longer needing to hide behind my own breathing pattern, since its presence had clearly already been detected. At that point, I rolled over in my bed to see what exactly was happening beside me. And what I found waiting there completely changed the entire nature of that night. Lying next to me in my own bed was a strange man. Though calling him a man does not fully capture how unnatural and wrong his appearance actually was. His skin looked as though it were made of smoke or shadow rather than actual flesh, shifting and dark in a way that defied normal physical description. His eyes were like two small, glowing red lights, set deep within what should have been the sockets of his skull. The moment I registered what I was looking at, my body reacted instantly and instinctively, snapping into a full fight or flight response. I immediately tried to push him out of the bed, attempting to shove him away from me and off the mattress entirely. Unfortunately, the specific bed I had at the time was one of those taller beds designed with built-in storage space underneath, complete with raised safety bars along the side to prevent anyone from rolling off during the night. Because of those safety bars, my attempt to push him off the bed only succeeded in pressing him firmly up against them, rather than actually removing him from the bed altogether. As I struggled against him, I noticed that his skin felt strange to the touch, almost like rubber or some kind of elastic material rather than actual human skin, and his overall body felt significantly lighter than what you would expect from a man of his apparent size and build. Whatever this figure actually was, it became immediately clear to me in that moment that it was not human. Not in any conventional sense of the word. My continued attempts to physically fight him off did not appear to concern or deter him in any way. Instead, his expression twisted into something resembling a wide, unsettling grin, the kind of expression you might imagine on a spider that has successfully trapped prey within its web. Fully confident and unbothered by any struggling happening in front of it, slowly and deliberately, he began reaching one hand toward my throat, moving with an unhurried, almost taunting motion, as though he wanted me to fully understand that my efforts to fight back meant nothing to him, that he had complete control over what was happening between us in that moment. As he continued reaching for my throat, he began climbing further onto the bed, positioning his body on top of mine, apparently trying to gain a better physical angle from which to carry out the strangulation he clearly intended. However, this shift in his positioning ended up giving me exactly the opportunity I needed to fight back effectively. As he climbed higher onto the bed to get on top of me, his center of mass rose above the level of the safety bars running along the side of the bed. With my feet firmly planted against him, positioned roughly where I judged his ribs to be, I used every bit of strength I had to deliver one hard, forceful push, sending him flying off the bed and down onto the floor below. He hit the ground with a strange sound, one that reminded me distinctly of a folded blanket landing on the floor rather than the sound you would expect from an actual human body making that same kind of impact. Almost immediately after hitting the ground, he picked himself back up, though not in any normal, human way. Instead, he moved onto all fours, scrambling and clambering his way out of my room in that awkward, animalistic posture. Before he fully left the room, though, he paused for just a moment, and his mouth and eyes twisted unnaturally around his face, repositioning themselves so that he could look directly back at me one final time. As he did this, he made a sound that fell somewhere between a hiss and a low, threatening growl. Then he continued scurrying away, moving in the direction of the bedrooms belonging to my sisters and my mother, disappearing from my sight entirely. At the time all of this happened, I genuinely believed the entire experience had simply been an intense nightmare, especially given that I had been having a lot of nightmares during that general period of my childhood. However, when I actually woke up properly the following morning, I noticed something that immediately gave me pause. My bedroom door was standing open. This detail mattered significantly, because my mother had come into my room earlier that same night to say goodnight to me before bed, and she had specifically closed the door behind her when she left the room afterward, as she always did. Finding the door open again the next morning meant that something or someone had come into my room again at some point during the night after she had left, entering quietly enough that I never woke up in response to the door itself opening, only to whatever happened once that presence had actually climbed into my bed beside me. Sometime later, long after that particular night, I ended up discussing this entire experience with one of my sisters, curious whether she might have any similar memories or experiences from that same house we had grown up in together. What she told me in response only added another unsettling layer to the entire situation. She mentioned that a ghost used to sleep next to her regularly in that same house, describing this presence as something she considered harmless, simply a strange but ultimately non-threatening part of her regular experience living there. I disagree entirely with her characterization of that presence as harmless. Ghosts, as far as I understand and believe, do not sleep, and they certainly should not be sleeping next to 9-year-old girls, regardless of how harmless or benign the experience might have felt to her at the time. Given what I personally experienced that night in my own bed, encountering a figure that was clearly not human, whose skin looked like smoke or shadow, whose eyes glowed with small points of red light, and who very deliberately attempted to strangle me before I managed to fight him off, I find it difficult to accept any framing of that same presence, or one similar to it, as something harmless, simply because it may have behaved differently or less aggressively around my sister on other occasions. It has now been 11 years since that particular night, and despite all the time that has passed, the memory of that experience has never fully faded or lost its intensity for me. I still find myself, even now as an adult, occasionally noticing that my breathing falls out of its normal, steady rhythm whenever I am lying alone in bed at night. An unconscious habit or reaction that I cannot help but connect back to that original night so many years ago, when my own irregular breathing was the very thing that first alerted me to a presence lying silently beside me in the dark, perfectly matching my breath in an attempt to remain hidden for as long as possible. Looking back on the entire experience now, with the distance of over a decade separating me from that actual night, I still find myself uncertain about exactly how much of what I remember reflects precise, accurate reality, and how much may have been shaped or altered over time by whatever underlying trauma that experience left behind. Memory, especially memory tied to deeply frightening childhood experiences, is not always a perfectly reliable record of events. And I recognize that possibility openly, rather than trying to claim absolute certainty about every single detail I have described. But even accounting for that uncertainty, certain specific elements of that night have remained remarkably consistent and vivid in my memory over the years, refusing to fade or blur the way so many of my other, more ordinary childhood memories naturally have with time. The detail of the breathing synchronizing so precisely with my own remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire memory for me, specifically because of how deliberate and calculated it felt, as though whatever this presence was had been specifically trying to remain concealed by matching my own breathing pattern so closely, only to reveal itself the moment I intentionally disrupted that pattern myself. That level of apparent intention and awareness on the part of whatever I encountered that night does not fit comfortably within typical explanations involving simple nightmares or half-asleep confusion, at least not in my own experience of trying to make sense of it in the years since. I also continue to find the detail about my bedroom door significant, given that it provides at least one small piece of external, physical evidence supporting the idea that something actually happened in my room that night, beyond whatever occurred purely within a dream. My mother closing that door before bed, followed by my discovery of it standing open the next morning, remains a specific, concrete detail that does not require relying purely on my own internal, potentially trauma-influenced memory of the more frightening events that unfolded within the room itself. My conversation with my sister, learning that she had her own separate, ongoing experience with what she described as a ghost sleeping next to her regularly in that same house, adds yet another layer of complexity to the entire situation, suggesting that whatever presence existed within that house was not limited to a single isolated encounter involving only myself. Whether her experiences and my own experience that night involved the exact same presence, or perhaps two entirely separate entities that happened to share that same physical space at different times, remains something I have never been able to determine with any real confidence. Even now, all these years later, I do not have any fully satisfying explanation for what actually happened to me that night. What I do know is that the fear and physical sensations I experienced during that encounter felt completely real to me in the moment, distinct and vivid in a way that continues to set that particular memory apart from typical, more forgettable nightmares I have had throughout my life. And whatever it actually was that came into my room that night, climbed into my bed beside me, and reached for my throat with such slow, deliberate intent, it remains, even after 11 years, one of the most unsettling and unresolved experiences of my entire life. One that continues to surface in small, quiet ways even now, every time my breathing happens to fall out of rhythm while lying alone in the dark. This happened when I was 18, during my first year of college in Nova Scotia. Before that week, I was not someone who believed strongly in ghosts or anything paranormal. I enjoyed scary stories, and I liked hearing people talk about haunted buildings, but I always assumed there had to be a normal explanation. Old houses made strange noises. People saw shadows when they were tired. Grief, stress, sickness, and lack of sleep could make the mind do strange things. That was how I thought before I moved into my dorm at St. Francis Xavier University. Most people simply called the university STFX, although some students had their own nicknames for it. I had just arrived on campus, and everything felt completely new. I was 18, living away from home for the first time, surrounded by hundreds of other young people who were just as excited and reckless as I was. The place was wild from the moment I got there. There was noise everywhere. Doors were slamming, music was blasting from different rooms, and people were running through the halls, introducing themselves to strangers as if they had already known one another for years. Someone always had a drink in their hand. Someone was always shouting from a window or knocking on a door. It felt less like a university residence and more like something out of Animal House. I even learned that Bubbles from Trailer Park Boys had once lived in the same residence. Whether that story was completely true or just something students like to repeat, I did not know. But it fit the atmosphere perfectly. The dorm was loud, chaotic, and full of strange characters. At the time, I knew almost nothing about the university's darker stories. I had no idea that one of the older parts of the campus was said to be haunted. I did not know about the stories involving a priest and a nun. I did not know about the courtyard, the old steeple, or the students who claimed to have heard crying in empty rooms. I only learned all of that later. According to the campus legend, long before the university became what it was, part of the site had been connected to an old Christian church or religious community that served Scottish immigrants arriving in Nova Scotia. The story changed slightly depending on who told it, but the main details were always the same. A priest and a nun had taken vows of chastity. Despite those vows, they began a secret relationship. Eventually, the nun became pregnant. The two of them were said to have been overwhelmed by guilt, shame, and fear. They believed they had broken their promises to God and disgraced the religious community around them. According to the legend, they could not live with what they had done. They both hanged themselves in the courtyard. I cannot say whether every detail of that story is historically true. It may have been exaggerated over the years, as campus legends often are. However, students spoke about it as if it were a well-known part of the university's history. The oldest section of the school, known as the Mount, had supposedly become the center of the haunting. The stories about the nun were usually the most frightening. Female students claimed they had seen her standing inside their dorm rooms at night. Some woke to find a pale figure near the window or beside the bed. Others said they heard a woman crying, but the sounds seemed to come from several directions at once. They would check the hallway and find nobody there. They would look in the bathroom, the stairwell, and nearby rooms, but the crying would continue. Sometimes it sounded close, as though someone were sobbing directly outside the door. A moment later, it seemed to come from the ceiling or from the far end of the building. The stories about the priest were different. There were many reports about him, but he was not described as violent or threatening. Students claimed he would appear in empty chairs in their rooms. Instead of attacking anyone, he would simply sit there and talk. Sometimes people said he gave advice. Sometimes he asked questions. Sometimes he appeared to be watching over someone who was frightened, sick, or lonely. The stories became so common that, according to students, part of the old building was eventually closed. Very few people wanted to live in a dorm with that kind of reputation. However, the university supposedly kept a few rooms available in case there were emergencies in other residences. If a pipe burst, a room flooded, or some other problem forced students to leave their regular dorm, they might be moved into the Mount. So not only would they be inconvenienced by whatever disaster had happened, but they would also have to sleep in the building everyone believed was haunted. I knew none of this during my first week. All I knew was that I had arrived at college and was ready to enjoy myself. For the first few days, I did exactly that. I met people, explored the residence, drank more than I should have, and tried to take in everything happening around me. I barely slept. Nobody seemed to sleep during that first week. There was always another room to visit, another party starting, or another person shouting for everyone to come downstairs. Then, about 3 days after I arrived, I began to feel sick. At first, it seemed like a normal cold. My throat felt sore, and I was more tired than usual. I blamed it on the drinking, the lack of sleep, and the stress of moving. By the next day, I knew it was something much worse. I had mononucleosis, or mono, and it hit me harder than any illness I had experienced before. My throat felt as if it had been cut open from the inside. Swallowing water hurt. Breathing through my mouth hurt. My whole body ached, and I had almost no strength. The fever was intense. I would wake up soaked in sweat, and then start shaking from the cold a few minutes later. I could not keep food down. I was vomiting, dehydrated, and constantly running to the bathroom. It was easily the sickest I had ever been. The timing made it even worse. Outside my room, everyone was celebrating the first week of college. Music shook the walls at night. People laughed in the hallway. Every few minutes, someone ran past my door or knocked because they wanted me to come out. Meanwhile, I could barely sit up. It was frustrating and lonely. I had imagined my first week of university would be full of fun, but instead, I spent most of it trapped in bed, listening to everyone else have the experience I had wanted. One morning, a student I had recently met came by to check on me. He would later become one of my best friends, but at that time we barely knew one another. He saw how sick I looked and offered me a bottle of Buckley's cough medicine. Buckley's has a strong taste that is almost impossible to describe. It is bitter, harsh, and medicinal. It tastes terrible, but it often helps. The bottle he gave me contained codeine. At the time, cough medicine containing codeine was much easier to get in Canada than many people from other countries might expect. Codeine is a powerful drug, and when it is mixed with illness, fever, dehydration, exhaustion, and alcohol, it can seriously affect the mind. I did not think much about that. I only wanted my throat to stop hurting. That evening, I was weaker than ever. Standing up took so much effort that I tried not to move unless I absolutely had to. My friend felt bad for me, so he brought a chair over and placed it at the end of my bed. He sat there for a while and kept me company. The dorm was still going crazy around us. Music came through the walls. People were yelling and laughing in the hallway. Every so often, someone opened the door, saw how sick I was, made a joke, and then disappeared again. My friend and I drank a little. I had a couple of beers, even though that was a terrible idea in my condition. I also took several doses of the Buckleys. My friend drank most of what he had brought for himself. We talked for a while, and the chair remained at the foot of my bed. Eventually, he decided to leave. It was still the first week of college, and nobody wanted to stay in one room all night when the whole residence felt like one enormous party. He asked if I would be all right. I told him I would. Then he left, closing the door behind him. The chair stayed where he had placed it. During the previous nights, my fever had caused intense hallucinations. I had full conversations with people who were not there. Some of them were friends or family members who lived more than 1,000 miles away. At the time, those conversations seemed completely normal. I would speak to someone for several minutes and never question how they had entered the room. I laughed at things nobody had said. I answered questions that existed only in my head. Sometimes I would suddenly realize that I was alone, but even that realization did not frighten me. It was like dreaming while awake. Because I was so feverish, Dehydrated and affected by the medicine, I usually accepted whatever I saw. My mind did not react with fear. Strange things happened, and I simply went along with them. That night was different. For the first time in several days, I fell asleep almost immediately. I did not spend hours staring at the ceiling or speaking to people who were not there. I remember closing my eyes, feeling exhausted, and then slipping into a deep sleep. I do not know how long I slept. The dorm was quieter when I woke, but it was not completely silent. I could still hear distant music and muffled voices somewhere in the building. What woke me was the sound of the chair moving. It scraped across the floor at the end of my bed. My eyes opened. For a moment, I did not understand where I was. The room was dark, and my mind was still heavy from sleep and medicine. Then, I remembered the chair. I looked toward the sound. A man was sitting in it. He was not leaning forward or moving around. He was sitting calmly, as though he had been waiting for me to wake up. The moment I saw him, I felt real fear. That is one of the main reasons this experience has stayed with me. During my other fever hallucinations, I had accepted everything without question. I had talked to people who were not there and laughed at things that made no sense. But this man felt different. My body reacted immediately. My chest tightened. My heart began pounding. Every part of me understood that someone was sitting inside my room when no one should have been there. He looked real. He was not transparent, glowing, or surrounded by mist. He did not look like the kind of ghost people describe in films. He looked like an ordinary man from another time. His hair was slicked back neatly. He wore round glasses with thin wire frames. His appearance was old-fashioned, though I could not have explained exactly why. There was something careful and controlled about him. He did not smile in a friendly way, but he did not look angry either. His face was calm and serious. The word I would use now is stoic. He seemed to understand that I was terrified. He did not make any sudden movements. He spoke slowly and carefully, as if he did not want to frighten me more than he already had. I wish I could remember every word of that conversation, but I cannot. I had a high fever, I was sick, and I had codeine and alcohol in my system. Some parts are missing. What I do remember is that what he said made sense. He did not speak in nonsense. He was not rambling or repeating strange phrases. We had a real conversation. He spoke to me as if he knew why he was there. I remember listening closely because I was afraid to look away from him. Part of me thought that if I turned my head, he might disappear. Another part feared that he might move closer. But he stayed in the chair. His voice was calm. He did not threaten me. He did not mention death or the haunting stories I would later hear. He did not say he was a priest or explain who he was. He simply talked. The strangest part was that the conversation began to calm me down. I was still scared, but the fear slowly changed. The man's presence did not feel evil. It did not feel as though he wanted to hurt me. It felt more as if he had come because I was sick and alone. At some point, I understood that the conversation was ending. Before he left, I asked him his name. He answered with a single word. Javan. That is how I remember hearing it. I do not know whether that was the correct spelling. It might have been Javan, Javin, Gavin, or another similar name. I only know how it sounded to me in that moment. After he told me his name, I fell asleep almost immediately. I do not remember watching him stand. I do not remember seeing him disappear. One moment he was sitting in the chair, and then I was asleep. When I woke the next morning, sunlight was coming into the room. The chair was still at the foot of the bed. It had been pulled slightly away from where my friend had left it, or at least that was how it appeared to me. The man was gone. I sat up slowly and waited for the pain and sickness to hit me. Instead, I realized that I felt better. Not completely healthy, but much better than I had felt in days. My fever had eased. My thoughts were clearer. My throat still hurt, and I was weak, but I no longer felt as though I were dying. I remembered the man almost immediately. At first, I assumed he had been another hallucination. That was the most reasonable explanation. I had been sick, feverish, dehydrated, and taking codeine. I had also been drinking alcohol. Seeing a man in a chair under those conditions was not impossible. Still, something about it bothered me. The other hallucinations had felt like dreams. I had accepted them easily, even when they made no sense. This experience had caused real shock and fear. The man had seemed aware of my reaction. He had adjusted the way he spoke because he knew I was frightened. The conversation had a beginning and an ending. And I remembered his name, Javon. After I recovered enough to leave my room, I began telling people about the strange things that had happened while I was sick. Most of the stories made them laugh. I told them about talking to people who were back home. I told them about laughing at nothing and answering questions nobody had asked. Everyone agreed that the fever and medicine had made me lose my mind for a few nights. Then, I told them about the man in the chair. The mood in the room changed. I described the sound of the chair being pulled out. I explained how I had woken and seen a man with slicked back hair and round wire-framed glasses. I told them that he had been calm, serious, and careful. I told them that he had spoken to me. Finally, I told them the name he had given me. Javon. People stopped laughing. They looked at one another in a way that made me uncomfortable. I asked what was wrong. That was when they told me the stories about the old part of the university. They told me about the priest and the nun. They told me about the secret relationship, the pregnancy, and the 2 deaths in the courtyard. They told me about the crying woman who appeared in female students' rooms. Then they told me about the priest. According to the stories, he often appeared in chairs. He did not usually frighten or attack people. He simply sat and talked. I felt cold when they said that. Until that moment, I had never heard the legend. It was my first week at the university, and I had spent most of it sick in bed. I had not gone on tours of the old building or stayed up late listening to campus ghost stories. I had no reason to imagine a calm priest sitting in a chair. I especially had no reason to describe the exact kind of behavior students had reported for years. People asked me more questions. What had he said? What was he wearing? Did he look old? Was I sure about the glasses? Was I sure he had been sitting in the chair and not standing near it? I answered as honestly as I could. I admitted that I had been very sick. I admitted that I had taken codeine and mixed it with alcohol. I knew that hallucination was the easiest and most likely explanation, but I also knew how real the man had felt. I knew the fear I had experienced was different from anything during the other fever dreams. I knew I had not heard the story before. Over time, I heard many versions of the campus legend. Some students believed every word. Others said it was nonsense created to scare first-year students. A few people claimed they had experienced strange things themselves. One student said she had heard crying in an empty hallway late at night. Another said a chair had moved across her room while she was alone. Someone else claimed he had woken to find a man sitting beside his desk. But when he turned on the light, the chair was empty. Each story made me think about that night again. I tried to research the name Javon, but I never found anything that completely proved who the man was. Maybe I had heard the name incorrectly. Maybe the ghost, if that was what he was, had not given me his real name. Maybe the whole experience had been created by my fever. I still do not know. I am not claiming that my story proves ghosts exist. There are too many normal explanations. I was extremely ill. I had barely slept. I was dehydrated. I had a high fever. I was taking a strong cough medicine containing codeine, and I had also been drinking. Any one of those things could have caused hallucinations. Together, they could have created something powerful and realistic. But the timing and the details are difficult for me to dismiss. Why did this hallucination feel different from the others? Why did the man sit in the exact chair my friend had placed at the end of the bed? Why did he behave like the priest from the stories I had never heard? Why did I wake the next morning feeling better than I had in days? Perhaps my mind had created a calm figure because I needed comfort. Perhaps I had heard part of the legend without remembering it. Maybe someone mentioned it in a hallway, and the information stayed in my mind. Those explanations are possible. Yet, whenever I remember the scrape of that chair across the floor, those explanations feel less convincing. I can still see him sitting there. His hair was slicked back. His round glasses caught what little light there was in the room. His face was calm, but serious. He knew I was scared, and he spoke carefully because of it. Most dreams fade with time. The details become weak and mixed together. This memory has never faded in the same way. I no longer remember everything he told me, but I remember the feeling of the conversation. I remember that his words made sense. I remember that I listened to him. And I remember asking his name, Javan. Before that night, I believed every paranormal story probably had a simple explanation. After that night, I was no longer so certain. I still question what happened. I still know that sickness and medicine can make the brain create people who are not there. But I also know that I saw a man sitting in a chair at the end of my bed. I know that he spoke to me. I know that days later, I learned the university was famous for stories about a dead priest who appeared in chairs and talked calmly to students. Maybe it was only a hallucination. Maybe it was something else. Either way, it changed the way I think about the paranormal. Life is strange, and some experiences do not fit neatly into the explanations we give them. I will never forget that room. I will never forget the chair. And I will never forget the man who told me his name was Javan. I grew up in a small town in Central Europe during the late 1980s. It was the kind of place where almost everyone knew everyone else, or at least believed they did. News traveled quickly, privacy was rare, and even small family arguments could become public knowledge by the end of the day. Our town was not especially beautiful or important. It had a few narrow streets, old houses, small gardens, a church, local shops, and fields stretching out beyond the last row of homes. Most people had lived there for generations. Families knew one another's histories, including old disagreements that had started long before I was born. As a child, I thought it was a safe place. There was very little serious crime. People sometimes argued over land, money, animals, or family problems. But murder was something that happened in large cities or in foreign films. It was not something we expected to happen among people we saw walking through town. My family lived in a small, old house. It was not in terrible condition, but it was cramped and worn. The walls were thick, the rooms were small, and everything seemed to need repairing. My parents had spent years saving money so they could build a newer home. Eventually, they managed to do it. The new house was built directly beside the old one on the same property. To me, the construction seemed to take forever. There were piles of bricks, wooden boards, bags of cement, and men moving around the site from early morning until evening. When the house was finally ready, We moved out of the old place and into the new one. The new house felt enormous compared with the old building, even though it was probably modest by most standards. It had brighter rooms, better windows, and more space. My parents were proud of it, but the construction had cost nearly everything they had. Money was very short. Because of that, they decided to rent out the old house. It seemed like a sensible choice. The building was still usable, and the rent would help with expenses. A family had recently moved into town and needed somewhere to live. I will not use their real name, but I will call the man of the family Shoemaker. At first, I did not know much about him. He seemed rough, but many adults in our area seemed rough to a child. He did not smile much, and when he did, there was something unfriendly about it. His family moved into our old house, only a few meters from where we now lived. My parents hoped the arrangement would be simple. The family would pay rent, look after the house, and live peacefully beside us. That was not what happened. They were difficult neighbors almost from the beginning. There were arguments about the yard, gates, tools, noise, and who had the right to use certain parts of the property. Shoemaker acted as if the old house and everything around it belonged to him. He often used areas of the yard that were meant to be shared. If my parents objected, he became angry. He was the kind of person who could turn a simple conversation into a confrontation. My parents tried to avoid fighting with him because we lived so close together. There was no fence or long road separating us. We could hear when doors slammed. We could see when someone entered the yard. Any conflict followed us directly to our front door. As a child, I did not understand all the details, but I felt the tension. I knew my parents regretted renting the house to that family. I heard them discussing the problem in low voices, especially at night. They were worried about money, the property, and what Shoemaker might do if they pushed him too hard. There was also a legal problem. At the time, local laws strongly protected tenants who paid their rent on schedule. As long as Shoemaker continued paying, removing him from the house was extremely difficult. He seemed to know this. No matter how unpleasant he became, my parents could not simply tell him to leave. He had rights as a tenant, and he used those rights like a shield. The old house belonged to my parents, but it no longer felt like part of our home. It felt occupied by people who disliked us. The event I remember most clearly involved my puppy. I had wanted a dog for a long time. When I finally got one, I loved it immediately. It was small, energetic, and still learning how to behave. It followed me around the yard, ran after anything that moved, and became excited whenever someone opened the door. Like most puppies, it was curious about everything. Having that dog gave me a kind of happiness that is difficult to explain. Children often form strong attachments to animals because animals do not argue, judge, or create complicated problems. The puppy was simply mine, and I cared about it deeply. Shoemaker did not like the dog. He used part of the yard and did not want the puppy wandering near him. I could tell it annoyed him. He complained about it, although the dog was still very young and not dangerous. I do not remember every word he said, but I remember the way he looked at the puppy. There was no warmth in his expression. One day, the puppy became terribly sick. The change happened suddenly. It began foaming at the mouth. It had severe diarrhea and looked as though it was in extreme pain. I was young and did not understand what was happening. I only knew that my dog was suffering and that the adults seemed frightened. The puppy died. The signs looked like poisoning. I cannot prove that Shoemaker did it. Nobody saw him give the dog anything, and there was no investigation. In those days, in a small town, the death of a puppy was not treated like a serious crime. But I have believed for most of my life that he was responsible. I believe he poisoned the dog because he did not want it in the part of the yard he used. Maybe I am wrong. It is possible the puppy ate something dangerous by accident. Dogs pick up food from the ground, especially when they are young. There may have been chemicals, spoiled food, or poison meant for rats. Still, the timing never felt accidental. Shoemaker had made it clear that he did not like the dog. Then the puppy died with signs of poisoning. I was heartbroken. The death also changed the way I saw that man. Before, he had been only an unpleasant neighbor. Afterward, I became afraid of him. Whenever I saw him outside, I wondered what kind of person could poison a child's puppy just because it was inconvenient. My parents did not accuse him directly. They had no proof, and they still had to live beside him. An accusation could have made the situation even worse. So, nothing happened. The puppy was buried, life continued, and Shoemaker remained in our old house. Years passed. I grew older and eventually left town to attend college. My school was far away, so I spent long periods away from my family. Leaving the town felt strange, but it was also a relief. I no longer had to see Shoemaker every day. I could focus on classes, friends, and building a life somewhere else. While I was away, his family finally moved out of our old house. They did not leave town. They moved only a couple of streets away into another rented property. When my parents told me, I could hear the relief in their voices. After years of tension, the family was finally gone from our land. The old house stood empty again. My parents never rented it to anyone else. The extra income would have helped them, but the experience had been too unpleasant. They preferred to leave the building unused rather than risk inviting another dangerous or difficult person so close to our home. For a while, everything seemed peaceful. Shoemaker was still in town, but he was no longer beside my family. His new landlord was someone else's problem. Then, that landlord disappeared. At first, people did not know what had happened. In a small town, a missing person creates immediate rumors. Some people said the man had left suddenly. Others thought he had gone to visit relatives. A few believed there had been an accident. But as the days passed, the situation became more serious. The missing man had not contacted anyone. He had not taken the things he would normally need for a trip. His family and friends were worried. The police began asking questions. Shoemaker and one of his friends knew exactly where the landlord was. They had killed him. The murder was connected to money. I never knew every detail, and different people repeated different versions, but the basic facts became clear. Shoemaker and his friend had an argument with the landlord over money. At some point, the situation turned violent, and they murdered him. Afterward, they had to decide what to do with the body. They took it outside town and buried it in a ditch. The area around our town was mostly quiet countryside. There were narrow roads, fields, patches of trees, drainage ditches, and places where someone might believe a body would never be found. They must have thought the first burial was good enough. For a week or two, the landlord remained in that ditch while people searched for him. The police started looking more closely into his disappearance. Questions were being asked. People were talking. Shoemaker and his friend became nervous. Maybe they were afraid the burial site was too close to town. Maybe they believed someone had seen them. Maybe one of them had left evidence behind. Whatever the reason, they decided to move the body. That detail has always disturbed me more than almost anything else. The first burial happened soon after the murder, when they may have been panicked and desperate, but days later, they returned to the grave. By then, they had time to understand what they had done. They had watched the landlord's family worry. They had heard people asking where he was. They knew the police were searching. Still, instead of confessing, they went back. They dug up the corpse and planned to bury it farther away. I try not to imagine that night too clearly. I picture the empty countryside, the darkness, and two men returning to the ditch with shovels. I imagine them digging through the soil until they reached the body. It was not enough for them to kill a man and hide him once. They were prepared to handle his remains again, transport him, and place him in another grave. At some point, one of the two men broke. Maybe fear became stronger than loyalty. Maybe he realized that Shoemaker would blame him if the police got close. Maybe the sight of the body during the second burial was too much. Whatever happened, one of them talked. The police learned the truth, and both men were arrested. The case appeared in the newspapers. Because it happened near our town, almost everyone knew about it. People bought the papers, shared the details, and discussed the crime in homes, shops, and streets. There was no mystery left. Shoemaker and his friend had killed the landlord over money, buried him in a ditch, then dug up the body so they could move it somewhere else. When I heard what had happened, my first thought was about my puppy. I remembered the foam around its mouth. I remembered how suddenly it became sick. I remembered Shoemaker's dislike of the dog and the cold way he had looked at it. For years I had wondered whether I had judged him unfairly. After the murder, I stopped doubting myself. The man I had suspected of poisoning my puppy had gone on to murder his next landlord. My parents had lived beside him for years. He had been inside a house they owned. He had walked through our yard. He had argued with them and acted as though the property belonged to him. The thought was terrifying. What if my parents had confronted him more strongly? What if they had tried to remove him? What if an argument over rent or the yard had turned violent? His next landlord had died over money. My parents had also been his landlords. We realized how easily they could have become his victims. The local tenant laws that made it difficult to remove him had once felt frustrating and unfair. Later, I wondered whether those laws had accidentally protected my parents. Because they could not evict him, they avoided a direct confrontation. They waited until he chose to leave. If they had forced him out or threatened him, perhaps the story would have ended differently. For a long time, people in town spoke about the murder. Some were shocked because they had known the victim. Others were shocked because they had known Shoemaker and had never imagined he was capable of killing someone. My family was less surprised. We had seen his anger. We had felt the tension around him. We had suspected what he had done to a harmless animal. To us, the murder felt like a terrible confirmation of something we had sensed years earlier. Shoemaker was sent to prison. For a while, it was comforting to know he was locked away. The town felt safer without him. But prison sentences end. Years passed, and eventually, he was released. He returned to the same town. That is perhaps the strangest part of the whole story. In a large city, a convicted killer might disappear into a crowd. In a small town, there is no crowd to disappear into. People know who he is. They know what he did. They remember the missing landlord, the ditch, and the second burial. They remember the newspaper reports and the police investigation. Yet Shoemaker walks through the same streets again. He goes to the same shops and passes the same homes. People see him and recognize him. Some avoid him. Some stare. Others pretend not to notice. I have often wondered what he thinks when he passes our old house. Does he remember living there? Does he remember my puppy? Does he remember my parents, who once collected rent from him and were relieved when he left? I do not know whether he feels guilt or shame. A person capable of killing someone, burying the body, digging it up, and trying to hide it again may not experience those emotions in the same way most people do. When I think back to my childhood, the most frightening part is how ordinary everything looked. Shoemaker did not live in a dark mansion or hide deep in the forest. He lived in a small rented house beside a family. He paid rent. He walked through the yard. He spoke to neighbors. He looked like a normal man. That is what makes the story frightening to me. People often imagine dangerous men as obvious monsters. We expect them to look different, speak differently, or give some clear warning of what they are capable of doing. But real evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it moves into the house next door. Sometimes it complains about a puppy. Sometimes it pays rent on time. And sometimes, years later, it kills the next landlord and buries him twice. This did not happen to me directly. It happened to my parents years ago, and they told me the story many times. Even though I was not there to see it, the way they described that night always made it feel very real to me. It was not a ghost story or something supernatural. It was the kind of fear that comes from knowing real people are outside your home, watching it, testing the doors, and trying to get inside while you are asleep. At that time, my parents lived in a house with a back garden. The garden was surrounded by a fence that was about 6 feet high. Behind the house, there was a shed where they kept tools and other things. There were also French doors at the back of the house, leading from one of the rooms into the garden. Near those doors was the kitchen and the back entrance. The area was usually quiet at night. Like most people, my parents felt safe inside their own home. They locked the doors before going to bed, turned off the lights, and expected the night to pass without anything unusual happening. There had been some talk in the area about burglaries, but at first it did not feel like something that would happen to them. People often hear about crime happening a few streets away and still believe their own home will be safe. You tell yourself that burglars will choose another house, or that they will be frightened off by a dog, a car in the drive, or a light left on. My parents did not know that their house was being watched. One night, my mother was lying in bed beside my father. The house was dark and quiet, and she was either asleep or close to falling asleep. At some point during the night, she felt my father move beside her. He got out of bed. At first, she did not think much about it. She assumed he was going to the bathroom or getting a glass of water. People wake up during the night for ordinary reasons, so she stayed in bed and tried to go back to sleep. My father, however, had heard something. It was not a loud crash or the sound of glass breaking. It was a quieter, stranger noise coming from somewhere around the back of the house. It may have been the sound of movement in the garden, something brushing against the shed, or the faint sound of someone touching a door. At first, he stayed still and listened. The house was silent again. For a moment, he may have wondered whether he had imagined it. Houses make noises at night. Pipes creak. Wood changes with the temperature. Wind moves things in the garden. Animals sometimes knock over bins or scratch near fences. Then he heard something else. That was when he decided to get up and check. He moved carefully through the dark house, trying not to make too much noise. He did not switch on every light because he did not yet know what was happening. He may have believed there was a cat in the garden or someone walking nearby. He went into the back bedroom and approached the window. From that window, he could see the garden below. When he looked outside, he saw lights moving in the darkness. They were not garden lights or reflections from a passing car. They were flashlights. Someone was inside the garden. My father froze for a second as he watched the beams moving across the ground. The lights swept over the grass, the fence, and the area around the shed. Whoever was outside was not simply passing by. They had already climbed into the garden and were searching around the back of the house. There was more than one person. My father immediately understood that this was not a harmless mistake. These people had entered the property during the night, and they were trying to stay hidden. He turned and rushed back toward the bedroom. My mother had been lying there, waiting for him to return. A few minutes had passed since he first got out of bed. Then, suddenly, he came running into the room. He was moving quickly and looking for clothes. My mother could tell from the way he was behaving that something was seriously wrong. He was not calm, and he did not stop to explain everything. He began throwing on whatever clothes he could find. She asked what was happening. He told her that there were people in the garden. The moment she heard that, she was wide awake. My father quickly dressed, then ran out of the bedroom and headed downstairs. He did not know exactly what the intruders were doing, but he knew he had to see whether they were trying to enter the house. My mother stayed upstairs, frightened and confused, listening to his footsteps as he hurried down. From downstairs, my father moved toward the back of the house. He approached the French doors and looked outside. That was when he saw them clearly. There were two men in the garden. Both of them were dressed completely in black. Their clothes covered them from head to toe, and both wore balaclavas over their faces. Only their eyes were visible. Seeing them dressed that way removed any doubt about why they were there. They were not drunk people who had entered the wrong garden. They were not neighbors looking for a lost pet. They had come prepared to break in without being recognized. One of the men was near the shed. He appeared to be trying to force his way inside. The shed contained tools and other property that could be stolen or possibly used to enter the house. The second man was closer to the kitchen and the back door. He was trying to break into the house itself. For a moment, my father watched them from inside. They did not seem to know he was standing on the other side of the French doors. That must have been one of the most terrifying moments of the night. The only thing separating my father from two masked burglars was glass. He could see them, but they had not yet noticed him. He did not know whether they were carrying weapons. He did not know whether they would run if they were discovered or whether they would become violent. He also knew my mother was upstairs. He could not simply stand there and wait for them to break through the kitchen door. My father reacted without thinking too much about the danger. He raised his hands and hammered hard against the French doors. The sudden pounding exploded through the quiet house and garden. The burglars looked up. For a second, they saw my father standing behind the glass. The reaction was immediate. Both men turned and ran. They did not stop to threaten him or continue trying to enter. They moved across the garden as quickly as they could. When they reached the 6-foot fence, they climbed or leaped over it and disappeared into the darkness. They were gone within seconds. My father remained by the doors, staring outside and trying to see where they had gone. His heart was racing, and the garden looked empty again. The whole event had happened very quickly. A few minutes earlier, he had been asleep in bed. Now he was downstairs, facing the place where two masked men had been trying to enter his home. My mother came downstairs after the danger had passed, though she was still frightened. My father explained what he had seen. Two men, black clothing, balaclavas, flashlights in the garden. One at the shed, one at the back door. They checked the locks and looked for signs of damage. The burglars had not managed to get inside, but they had clearly begun trying. There may have been marks around the door, the shed, or the locks. Even without serious damage, the proof was there. This had not been a dream or a misunderstanding. Someone had tried to break into their home while they were sleeping. They contacted the police and reported what had happened. The police took the details, but at that moment, there was probably very little they could do. The men had escaped into the night, and because their faces had been covered, my father could not identify them. He could only describe their clothing, their general size, and what they had been doing. The burglars had chosen their clothes carefully. Black clothing helped them hide in the darkness, while the balaclavas protected their identities. They were prepared and knew what they were doing. That made the incident even more disturbing. These were not careless thieves acting without a plan. They had entered the garden quietly, carried flashlights, covered their faces, and separated so they could attack two different parts of the property. One focused on the shed while the other tried the house. They might have believed everyone inside was asleep. My father often wondered what would have happened if he had not heard the noise. The man near the kitchen might have forced the door open. Once inside, the burglars could have moved through the house while my parents were still in bed. Maybe they only wanted money or valuables. Maybe they would have run if someone woke up. Or maybe the situation would have become violent. There was no way to know, and that uncertainty stayed with my parents. The burglars did not stop after that night. Later, my parents learned that two men had been carrying out a series of burglaries in the area. They had targeted other homes and properties, entering gardens, sheds, and houses. The descriptions matched the men my father had seen. The pair continued until the police eventually caught them. When the truth came out, it became clear that my parents had not been unlucky victims of one random event. Their home had been part of a larger pattern. The men had likely watched houses before approaching them. They may have studied which properties were easy to enter, which gardens were hidden, and which homes appeared dark and quiet at night. It was possible that they had watched my parents' house earlier that day or on a previous evening. That thought was frightening in a different way. The burglars may have stood somewhere nearby, looking at the doors, windows, fence, and shed. They may have waited until the lights went out before climbing into the garden. My parents never knew how long the men had been outside before my father woke. Maybe they had only just arrived. Maybe they had been moving around the property for several minutes. Maybe they had already tried other windows or doors. After the incident, the house no longer felt the same. Before that night, darkness had felt normal. The garden at night had simply been the garden. The fence was a boundary, and the locked doors created a sense of safety. Afterward, every sound had a new meaning. A branch scratching against a window could sound like someone touching the glass. A bin moving in the wind could sound like footsteps. A cat jumping onto the fence could make my father sit up in bed and listen. Even when he knew the burglars had been caught, it was difficult for him to relax. A few days after the attempted break-in, my father installed sensor lights around the property. The lights were designed to switch on whenever they detected movement. If someone entered the garden at night, the area would suddenly become bright. The idea was simple. Burglars depended on darkness. A strong light could expose them, frighten them, and alert everyone inside the house. My father placed the lights so they covered the back garden, the shed, and the doors. He wanted there to be no dark area where someone could hide. Once they were installed, every small movement activated them. Cats, birds, wind-blown branches, and other harmless things sometimes caused the lights to come on. Each time that happened, my father looked outside. Even if he knew it was probably nothing, he had to check. For a while, he struggled to sleep properly. He would lie awake and listen to the house. If he heard a small sound, his body became tense. He remembered the flashlights moving through the garden and the two figures dressed in black. Sometimes he got out of bed and checked the windows. Other times, he went downstairs to make sure the doors were locked. My mother also felt less safe, but my father seemed to carry the strongest reaction. He had been the one who had seen them at close range. He had stood behind the French doors while one man tried to break into the house. The image stayed in his mind. Two masked faces turning toward him. Two figures running across the garden. 2 bodies disappearing over the fence. The police eventually catching the burglars gave my parents some relief, but it did not completely remove the fear. The men were no longer free to return, but the incident had shown my parents something they could not forget. A locked door did not always mean nobody would try to enter. A high fence did not always keep strangers out. And a quiet neighborhood was not always safe. My father had always believed he would know how to react in a dangerous situation, but until that night, it had only been an idea. When the moment came, he did not hide or freeze. He rushed downstairs and confronted the burglars from behind the glass. It was brave, but it was also dangerous. Looking back, he knew the men might have been armed. If one of them had carried a gun, knife, or heavy tool, pounding on the doors could have caused a very different reaction. They might have tried to break the glass. They might have entered and attacked him. Fortunately, they chose to run. My parents sometimes talked about how close the situation had come to becoming much worse. The burglar at the back door might have been only a few minutes away from getting inside. If my father had slept more deeply, or if the television, wind, or rain had covered the sound, he may never have woken. My mother might have opened her eyes to hear strangers moving downstairs. They might have found 2 masked men standing inside the bedroom. That possibility frightened her for a long time. The attempted burglary did not leave physical injuries, but it changed the way both of them behaved. They became more careful about locking doors and windows. They checked the garden before going to bed. They paid attention to unfamiliar cars and people walking slowly through the area. The sensor lights remained an important part of the house. Over time, my father began sleeping better again, but he never completely returned to the way he had been before. Once someone has tried to enter your home at night, it becomes difficult to forget. Home is supposed to be the one place where you can close the door and feel protected from the outside world. When strangers cross that boundary, even if they do not manage to enter, they take away part of that feeling. Years later, my parents could still describe the night clearly. My mother remembered feeling my father leave the bed and assuming he would return in a minute. She remembered him suddenly running back into the room, rushing to put on clothes, and then disappearing downstairs. My father remembered hearing the strange noises. He remembered standing at the back bedroom window and seeing flashlight beams moving through the garden. He remembered the men in black. He remembered one of them near the shed and the other trying to enter through the kitchen or back door. Most of all, he remembered hammering against the French doors and seeing both men react. They had probably believed the house was silent and everyone inside was asleep. Instead, my father appeared behind the glass and destroyed their plan. The burglars leaped over the 6-foot fence and vanished, but the fear they left behind remained for much longer. The story has always stayed with me because there is nothing supernatural about it. There was no ghost at the window and no strange creature in the garden. There were only 2 real men in black clothing and balaclavas standing outside a sleeping family's home. Sometimes that is far more frightening than anything paranormal. My father happened to wake up at the right moment. He heard a sound that could easily have been ignored. He decided to investigate. Because of that, the burglars never made it inside. My parents were safe, and nothing was taken. But for weeks afterward, my father struggled to close his eyes without imagining flashlights moving through the darkness again. I had just moved into a new rental house when this happened. It was supposed to be the beginning of a better period in my life. I was a young single mother with an infant, trying to work, pay bills, and build a stable home for my child. Moving was stressful, but I remember feeling proud that I had managed to get us into a place of our own. The house was part of a rental property with assigned parking spaces. Each space was connected to a specific house, so anyone looking at the parking area could easily work out which vehicle belonged to which tenant. At the time, I did not think much about that. It seemed convenient. I knew exactly where to park, and I never had to worry about another tenant taking my space. I owned a white minivan. It was not a special or expensive vehicle, but it was important to me. It carried my baby, groceries, and everything else I needed. As a single mother, I depended on it every day. If the van stopped working, I could not easily get to work or take my child to my grandmother's house. I spent my first night in the new home surrounded by boxes and half-unpacked belongings. Anyone who has moved knows how strange the first night feels. The rooms are unfamiliar. Every sound catches your attention, and nothing is where you expect it to be. The house did not yet feel like home. It smelled different from my previous place. The walls, floors, and doors were unfamiliar. I did not know which noises were normal. A small sound from the pipes or roof could make me stop and listen. Still, nothing frightening happened during the night. At least, I did not know that anything had happened. The next morning, I got ready for work. I had my infant with me, and I was already thinking about everything I needed to do. I had to take the baby to my grandmother's house, get to work on time, and somehow continue unpacking later. I walked outside toward my white minivan. That was when I noticed something was wrong. The front license plate was missing. At first, I stood there staring at the place where it should have been. I thought maybe I was mistaken. Moving had left me tired, and I had a lot on my mind. I walked closer and looked carefully. The plate was definitely gone. It had not fallen off. Someone had removed it. I felt confused more than frightened. Why would anyone steal only the front license plate from an ordinary minivan? The van was still there. The windows were not broken. I did not immediately notice any serious damage. I opened the door and got inside. Then I realized my Wells Fargo debit card was missing. I searched for it several times. I checked the usual places, then looked through everything again. I checked my purse, the seats, the floor, and the center area of the van. The card was gone. Now, I knew the missing license plate was not an accident. Someone had entered my vehicle during my first night in the new house. They had gone through my things, taken my debit card, and removed my front license plate. I should have called the police immediately, but I was young, overwhelmed, and already late. I had a baby to take care of and a job I could not afford to lose. I did not know how serious the situation was. At that moment, I thought it was ordinary theft. It was upsetting, but I did not imagine it was connected to anything larger. I drove to my grandmother's house because she was going to watch my baby while I worked. When I arrived, I told her what had happened. "My front plate is gone," I said, "and I can't find my Wells Fargo card." My grandmother told me to contact the bank and report the card as stolen. She also said I would need to go to the courthouse to arrange a replacement license plate. Her advice was practical and calm. Neither of us imagined that my missing items had already been used in a serious crime. I contacted the bank so the card could be canceled or protected. There were no fraudulent charges on it, which seemed strange. If someone had stolen a debit card, I expected them to use it. But no money had been taken. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it left me wondering why someone had taken the card at all. I could not deal with the license plate immediately because I had to go to work. I told myself I would handle everything later. The whole day, the incident stayed in the back of my mind. Someone had been near my new house while I slept. Someone had opened my van and touched my belongings. I kept wondering whether I had forgotten to lock the door. Maybe I had been distracted while moving and left it open. Maybe someone had been walking through the parking area, checking vehicles until they found mine. I tried not to let my imagination get out of control. I needed to focus on work. By the time I finished and returned to my grandmother's house, it was evening. I still needed to make a police report about the missing license plate. I decided to call the non-emergency police number. I explained that I had recently moved into a new rental house. I told them that when I went outside that morning, my front license plate was missing. I also said my Wells Fargo debit card had disappeared from the van. I was not sure whether the two missing items were connected, but it seemed likely. The person on the phone asked for my information. They wanted my name, address, vehicle details, and other basic facts. Then they asked where I was. I told them I was at my grandmother's house. They said someone would come by and take a report. That seemed like more attention than I expected. No money had been taken from my bank account, and I assumed the stolen plate would be treated as a minor theft. Still, I waited. Around 10 or 20 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. I expected a local police officer. Instead, when the door opened, there were men in dark suits standing outside. A black SUV was parked nearby. They looked like something from a film. They wore serious expressions and dark clothing. The whole scene reminded me of Men in Black, except nobody was smiling and it did not feel entertaining. They were with the FBI. My first reaction was confusion. Why would the FBI be at my grandmother's house because one license plate and a debit card had been stolen? They began asking questions immediately. They asked where I had been. They wanted to know who could confirm my location at different times during the day. They asked who I had been with and whether anyone could support my story. Then they asked whether I knew a man with a certain name. I did not recognize the name. I told them I had never heard of him. They asked again in different ways. Was I sure I did not know him? Had I ever met him? Was he a friend, former boyfriend, relative, co-worker, neighbor, or acquaintance? I kept telling them no. I had no idea who they were talking about. The questions made me increasingly nervous. I had never been in serious trouble before. I had no criminal background and no experience being questioned by federal agents. I was a young single mother standing in my grandmother's house, trying to understand why men from the FBI seemed interested in every part of my day. For a moment, I wondered whether I had done something wrong by waiting until the evening to report the theft. Should I have called the police as soon as I saw the missing plate? Did they think I was hiding something? Was I in trouble because I had driven the van without the front plate? The situation became more frightening with every question. I started thinking about my baby. I imagined being arrested for something I did not understand. I wondered whether someone had used my debit card to commit fraud, or whether my license plate had been placed on a stolen vehicle. The agents were not behaving casually. They were careful, direct, and serious. I tried to answer everything honestly. I explained that I had spent the first night in my new rental. I had left in the morning, noticed the missing plate, and then discovered the debit card was gone. I had taken my baby to my grandmother's house and gone to work. I told them who could confirm where I had been. My grandmother could confirm that I had brought the baby to her house. People at work could confirm that I had been there during the day. I repeated that I did not know the man whose name they kept mentioning. Eventually, one of the agents seemed satisfied that I was telling the truth. He told me they had my license plate and debit card. For a second, I felt relieved. Then he added that I was not getting them back. They were evidence. That word made the situation feel much more serious. Evidence of what? I wanted answers, but the agents did not explain much. They simply told me the plate and card were connected to an investigation. Then they left. The entire visit felt unreal. One moment, my grandmother and I had been waiting for a regular officer to take a theft report. The next, We had been questioned by federal agents who arrived in a black SUV. After they were gone, I stood there trying to understand what had just happened. My license plate had been found. My debit card had been found. Both were now evidence. The FBI had asked whether I knew a specific man. I still had no idea what crime had taken place. Then my grandmother and I turned on the evening news. A report came on about a robbery at Wells Fargo. A man had robbed the bank. He had escaped in a white van. The police had later found a white van in a hotel parking lot. The hotel was close to my new rental house. Then the news showed the suspect's name. It was the same name the FBI agents had asked me about only minutes earlier. That was when everything came together. During my first night in the new house, a stranger had apparently passed through the area and found my minivan. He had entered the vehicle. He had taken my Wells Fargo debit card. He had removed my license plate. Then, the next morning, he had robbed a Wells Fargo bank. He had used a white van with my stolen license plate attached to it. The bank, the vehicle, the card, and the plate all made it look as though I might be connected to the crime. That was why the FBI had come to question me. They needed to know whether I knew the robber. They needed to check whether I had helped him or allowed him to use my license plate. My stolen debit card made the connection even more suspicious. It was a Wells Fargo card, and he had robbed a Wells Fargo bank. What had looked like a minor vehicle break-in was actually part of a bank robbery. When the news showed the man, I found him frightening. There was something about his appearance that made my skin crawl. He looked like the kind of person I would have avoided if I had seen him nearby. Knowing he had been at my van made the situation feel personal. I had never met him. I had never seen him in my house. He had never directly threatened me. But he had been close enough to touch my things. He had opened my vehicle while I slept only a short distance away. He had searched through it, found my debit card, and taken the time to remove the license plate. I could not stop imagining his hands inside my van. He may have touched the steering wheel, seats, door handles, and items belonging to my baby. He had been inside a space I used every day. I began thinking about how close he had been to my home. Because the rental property had assigned parking, the parking space showed exactly which house the van belonged to. He could have looked from the vehicle toward my front door and known where I lived. He could have seen that I was a woman, alone with an infant. I do not know whether he watched the house. I do not know whether he tried the door. I do not know how long he stayed near the property. Those unanswered questions were worse than the facts I knew. What would have happened if I had walked outside while he was removing the license plate? What if my baby had started crying loudly and caught his attention? What if he had decided that entering the house would be easier than robbing the bank? What if I had left a door unlocked while carrying boxes inside? I knew the robbery had probably been random. The man was from out of state and had apparently happened to come across my vehicle. There was no reason to believe he had chosen me personally. My van was white, which matched the vehicle he planned to use. The debit card was from Wells Fargo, which may have been useful as part of his robbery or simply an item he took while searching. My license plate gave him a way to disguise his escape vehicle. I had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Knowing it was random did not make me feel safe. In some ways, it made the experience more frightening. A person did not have to hate me, follow me, or plan to target me. A dangerous stranger could simply pass my home, see my vehicle, and enter my life without warning. After that night, I could not feel comfortable in the new rental. I had spent only one night there, but the place already felt unsafe. The parking space was connected to my address. Anyone standing near my van could identify my home. The locks no longer felt strong enough. I kept thinking about how easily the man had entered the vehicle. I did not know whether he had copied anything, taken anything else, or left something behind. I also did not know whether he had friends who knew where he had stolen the plate. Even after he was identified, I feared someone might return. For about 3 months, I avoided staying at the rental. I stayed with family because I did not feel safe sleeping there with my baby. Every time I thought about returning, I imagined waking up to footsteps inside the house. I imagined seeing a stranger standing near the baby's room. I knew those thoughts were probably not realistic, but fear does not always respond to logic. The landlord eventually replaced the locks and installed new deadbolts. I was also approved to park in a different space, one that did not clearly identify which house I lived in. Those changes helped, but they did not erase what had happened. The new deadbolts gave me more confidence that the doors were secure. The different parking space made it harder for a stranger to connect my van directly to my home. Eventually, I returned. Even then, I checked the locks repeatedly. Before going to bed, I looked through the windows and made sure nobody was standing near the van. Small sounds outside made me tense. Sometimes I would wake during the night and remember that the bank robber had once been only a few steps from the house. The experience changed the way I felt about personal space. Before it happened, my car was only a vehicle. Afterward, I understood how violated a person can feel when a stranger enters it. The van held pieces of my life. There may have been baby items, receipts, personal papers, small belongings, and things I touched every day. A stranger had moved through that space without my permission. He had taken 2 ordinary items and turned them into evidence in a federal crime. For a while, I worried that people might think I had been involved. My license plate had been on the escape vehicle. My Wells Fargo card was connected to the robbery. The FBI had needed to confirm my whereabouts. Even though I had done nothing wrong, that feeling of being questioned stayed with me. The agents were doing their jobs. They had to investigate every connection. From their point of view, it was possible that I knew the suspect or had given him the items. Still, being treated like a possible part of a bank robbery was terrifying. I never want to experience that kind of questioning again. It was not like being asked a few simple questions by a local officer. The men arrived already knowing things about the case that I did not know. They had my property. They knew the suspect's name. They knew the vehicle connected to the robbery. I was the only person in the room who did not understand what was happening. That helplessness made the experience worse. Years later, I can still remember the moment the news report came on. I can remember hearing the man's name and recognizing it immediately. I can remember looking at my grandmother and realizing why the FBI had been there. The missing plate, the debit card, the white van, and the Wells Fargo robbery were all part of the same story. It still gives me a horrible feeling. Not because I saw the robbery, not because the man entered my house. I never saw him in person, but I know he was there. While I was inside with my infant, sleeping in a new and unfamiliar house, he was outside near my vehicle. He opened the van and touched my belongings. He removed the license plate. Then he used it while committing a bank robbery. The distance between my life and his crime was only a door, a parking space, and a few hours. I have replayed the possibilities many times. What if I had heard him outside? What if I had looked through the window? What if I had gone to the van to get something? What if he had decided to enter the house? I will never know what he might have done if we had met. Maybe he would have run. Maybe he would have threatened me. Maybe something much worse would have happened. That is what stayed with me more than the FBI visit or the news report. The unknown possibilities. The fact that a violent stranger had come close to my home while my baby and I were inside. People sometimes say an experience was not truly frightening because nothing happened directly. I was not attacked. My child was not harmed. The man did not enter my house, but fear does not always come from what happened. Sometimes it comes from understanding how close something terrible came to happening. I was lucky. The robber wanted the van's identity, not me. He took the license plate and card, committed his crime, and left the area. The FBI eventually understood that I was an innocent victim whose property had been stolen. My landlord improved the locks, and I was moved to a less obvious parking space. Life continued. But the sense of safety I had felt when I first moved into that house never fully returned. Even now, when I think about that first night, I imagine a stranger walking through the parking area and stopping beside my white minivan. I picture him looking toward the house. I picture him opening the door and searching through my things while I slept nearby with my infant. Then, I picture him driving away with my license plate attached to another white van, heading toward a Wells Fargo bank. I never actually saw him outside my home, but knowing he was there has always been enough.